Tonight, we will explore the weight of hidden actions and the Buddha's teaching on karma, how every deed, no matter how secret, eventually reveals itself through consequences we cannot escape. There is nothing you need to do, nothing to fix, no one you need to become. Simply rest here as we journey together through stories of choices made in shadow and the light that eventually finds them all. If this path of wisdom and rest calls to you, I invite you to subscribe and join our community of seekers who find peace through ancient teachings. But for now, simply be here. This moment is enough. Let us begin this journey together. Take a gentle breath now. Feel your body supported by whatever holds you. There is nowhere else you need to be. Let us explore a story about a woodcutter named Bhima, who thought the darkness of the forest could hide his deeds forever. In the mountains where the air grows thin and sacred groves have stood for 1,000 years, there lived a woodcutter named Bhima. His hands were scarred from decades of honest work, his back bent from carrying timber down narrow mountain paths. He knew every tree in the ordinary forests, every path that wound between the villages and the lumber mills. But Bhima also knew something else. He knew the location of the protected groves where sandalwood trees grew, trees so ancient and precious that cutting them was forbidden by both law and sacred tradition. The wood itself held a fragrance that could perfume an entire temple, worth more than a farmer's yearly harvest in just one small branch. For years, Bhima had walked past these sacred groves during his regular work, breathing in the sweet scent that drifted from their depths. The trees seemed to glow in the dappled sunlight, their bark smooth and unmarked by any axe. Local people spoke of them in whispers, saying the trees held the prayers of generations, that to cut them would invite the worst kind of misfortune. But Bhima's children were growing, and his wife's health was failing. The money from ordinary wood barely covered their needs. Each night, as he counted the few coins in his leather pouch, his mind returned to those sandalwood groves and the fortune they represented. The foreign merchants who came through the mountain passes paid gold for sandalwood, real gold. Enough gold to buy medicine for his wife, to send his sons to study in the city, to lift his family from the poverty that had marked 3 generations of woodcutters in his line. One moonless night in autumn, when the regular forest guards were celebrating a festival in the valley below, Bhima made his choice. He took his sharpest axe, wrapped its head in cloth to muffle the sound, and walked the familiar path to the sacred grove. The darkness was complete. No stars penetrated the canopy above. Bhima felt his way by touch, his hands recognizing the distinctive bark of sandalwood even in the blackness. The first tree he chose was not the largest. He was not greedy, he told himself, just enough to help his family, just this once. The axe bit into the sacred wood with a sound like a whispered prayer cut short. Bhima worked quickly, efficiently, his years of experience guiding each stroke. The tree fell with a soft crash, its branches catching on neighboring trees, the sound muffled by the thick forest floor. As he cut the trunk into pieces small enough to carry, the fragrance filled the air around him, sweet, rich, almost overwhelming in its intensity. It was more beautiful than he had imagined. More valuable too, he realized, as he calculated the gold each piece would bring. By dawn, Bhima had loaded his cart with carefully cut sections of sandalwood, covered them with ordinary pine boughs, and was traveling the back roads toward the border passes where the foreign merchants waited. The transaction was swift and silent. The merchant, a thin man with gold teeth who asked no questions, paid without argument. The weight of the gold coins in Bhima's hands was unlike anything he had ever held. Real wealth, real possibility. "You have more of this wood?" the merchant asked, his eyes already calculating future profits. Bhima hesitated for only a moment. "Perhaps, if the price remains good." "The price will always be good for sandalwood," the merchant said, his gold teeth flashing. "My people across the mountains pay 10 times what other wood brings. You could be a wealthy man if you have access to regular supply." That night, Bhima returned home with enough gold to pay for his wife's medicine, to buy better food than his family had eaten in years, to repair their roof before winter came. He told his wife he had found work with a wealthy merchant, cutting specialty timber. She asked no questions, too grateful for the medicine that immediately began to ease her constant pain. But as he lay awake that night, counting and recounting the coins, Bhima's mind was already returning to the sacred grove. One tree had brought this much gold. There were dozens of trees in that grove, hundreds perhaps. Let us pause here and take a gentle breath. Feel the air moving naturally in and out of your body. Notice how your shoulders can soften, how your jaw can release. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to understand. Simply rest in this moment. Within days, Bhima had returned to the sacred grove. This time, he brought proper tools, a saw that cut more quietly than an axe, ropes to control the fall of larger trees, a cart with wheels wrapped in cloth to move silently through the forest paths. The second tree was larger than the first. The merchant had been right. The quality of this sandalwood was extraordinary. The gold it brought was enough to transform Bhima's life completely. He bought land, hired workers to tend it, sent his eldest son to study with the scholars in the distant capital. But with each success came greater ambition. Why take only 1 tree per month when he could take 2? Why sell to just one merchant when others were willing to pay even more? The sacred grove was vast. No one had visited it in years. The forest guards rarely patrolled that deep into the mountains. Bhima began to cut more systematically. He mapped the grove, selecting the finest specimens first, working his way through the ancient trees with the methodical efficiency that had made him a good woodcutter in his honest days. He established relationships with 3 different networks of foreign merchants, playing them against each other to drive prices higher. The gold accumulated faster than Bhima had ever dreamed possible. He built a new house, larger than any other in his village. He bought his wife silk clothes and jewelry. He hired servants and teachers for his children. His neighbors whispered about his sudden wealth, but he explained it as lucky contracts with foreign merchants, specialty work that required discretion. For 2 years, Bhima's secret life continued. By day, he maintained the appearance of an ordinary woodcutter, taking small jobs around the village, complaining about low prices for timber like all the other workers. By night, when the moon was dark, he would disappear into the sacred grove and emerge with gold-bearing loads of the most precious wood in the mountains. He became skillful at covering his tracks. He learned to fell trees so they wouldn't be visible from the main paths. He discovered how to age the stumps with fire and acid so they looked like they had fallen naturally years before. He even planted ordinary trees in some of the gaps, though they would take decades to mature. The sacred grove, which had once been dense with ancient sandalwood, began to develop clearings. But they were far from any traveled path. Only someone walking deep into the interior would notice the changes. Bhima's family prospered beyond anything they had ever imagined. His wife's health improved with proper medicine and good food. His sons wore fine clothes and spoke of careers that would have been impossible for woodcutters' children just a few years before. His neighbors treated him with new respect, assuming his success came from hard work and wise business dealings. But success breeds carelessness. As Bhima's operation expanded, he began to take greater risks. He cut during lighter nights when the work went faster. He brought larger carts that could carry more wood, but made more noise on the mountain paths. He hired 2 local men to help with the heaviest lifting, paying them enough to ensure their silence, but revealing the location of his activities. He also became greedier. The largest, most ancient trees in the grove, trees that local legend said were planted by the first Buddhist monks to settle in these mountains, became irresistible targets. These trees were massive, their heartwood so saturated with fragrant oils that a single trunk could bring enough gold to buy a small palace. On a warm night in spring, when the snow had melted and the mountain paths were clear, Bhima and his 2 helpers made their way to the deepest part of the sacred grove. They had come for the largest tree of all, a sandalwood giant that stood in the exact center of the grove, its trunk so wide that 4 men holding hands could not encircle it. Local people called this tree the heart of the mountain. They said it had grown here before the first human settlement, that it contained the concentrated prayers and wisdom of every generation that had sheltered beneath its branches. To cut this tree, they believed, would be like cutting the spiritual heart from the entire region, but to Bhima, it represented enough gold to make his family wealthy for generations. The work of felling such a massive tree could not be done quietly. Even with the sharpest saws and the most careful technique, the process took most of the night and created sounds that echoed through the forest. The grinding of blades through ancient wood, the crack and groan of a giant beginning to fall, the earth-shaking crash when it finally came down. As dawn approached and they worked to section the massive trunk, Bhima felt a satisfaction deeper than any amount of gold could provide. He had conquered the unconquerable. He had turned the most sacred into the most profitable. The tree that had been worshipped for centuries now lay in pieces, ready to be converted into wealth. But in his triumph, he had grown too confident to notice the signs that should have warned him of approaching danger. The forest guards had been tracking unusual activity in the area for weeks. Local villagers had reported strange sounds echoing from the direction of the sacred grove on dark nights. More significantly, the sudden appearance of high-quality sandalwood in foreign markets had been traced back through the networks of merchants to this specific region. The head of the Forest Service, a man named Captain Mahesh, who had protected these mountains for 20 years, had been conducting a careful investigation. He knew that someone with extensive local knowledge was systematically harvesting from protected areas. He also knew that such an operation would eventually target the most valuable trees, including the heart of the mountain. On this particular dawn, as Bhima and his helpers loaded their cart with sections of the ancient tree, Captain Mahesh and 6 armed guards were already positioned along the only path that led out of the sacred grove. The trap had been set weeks ago. Now, it was simply a matter of waiting for the thieves to walk into it. Let us take another gentle breath here. Feel your body sinking more deeply into rest. There is nothing you need to figure out, nothing you need to solve. Simply allow this story to flow through you, like water through a riverbed. The sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the mountains when Bhima's cart rounded the bend where the guards waited. The weight of the massive tree sections made the cart move slowly, the wooden wheels creaking under their burden. Bhima walked beside his cart, thinking of the gold this load would bring, calculating the improvements he could make to his house, the gifts he could buy for his family. He was so absorbed in these pleasant thoughts that he almost walked directly into Captain Mahesh before noticing the uniformed man standing in the center of the path. "Good morning, Bhima," the captain said quietly. "You're traveling early today." Bhima's blood turned to ice, but years of maintaining his deception had taught him to think quickly under pressure. "Captain Mahesh," he said, managing to keep his voice steady. "Yes, I promised to deliver this timber to the village before the day grows hot." "This timber," Captain Mahesh repeated, stepping closer to the cart. He pulled back the pine boughs that covered the cargo, revealing the distinctive grain and color of sandalwood. The sweet fragrance immediately filled the morning air. "This is very fine timber indeed." "A special order," Bhima said, his mouth growing dry. "For a temple construction project." "A temple project?" The captain nodded thoughtfully. Then he walked around the cart, examining the wood more carefully. "And which temple commissioned this particular order?" Before Bhima could answer, one of the guards called out from deeper in the forest, "Captain, you need to see this." Captain Mahesh looked at Bhima for a long moment. "Wait here," he said. It was not a request. The captain disappeared into the forest, following the sound of his guard's voice. Bhima stood frozen beside his cart, his mind racing through possibilities for escape. But the remaining guards had positioned themselves to block both directions of the path. His two helpers stood nearby, their faces pale with terror, looking to him for guidance he could not provide. When Captain Mahesh returned, his expression had changed from suspicion to something much colder. "The heart of the mountain is gone," he said simply. "Cut down last night. The most sacred tree in these mountains, reduced to a stump and sawdust." Bhima tried to speak, but no words came. "Do you know what the penalty is for cutting protected sandalwood?" the captain continued. "Do you know what the penalty is specifically for destroying trees that have been designated as sacred heritage sites?" The world seemed to tilt around Bhima. He had known there were penalties for poaching from protected areas, but he had never inquired about the specific consequences. In his mind, the worst punishment would be a fine, maybe a short imprisonment. He was unprepared for what the captain said next. "Complete forfeiture of all property and assets," Captain Mahesh said, his voice carrying no emotion. "This includes your house, your land, your tools, everything you own or have purchased with money derived from these illegal activities. The law assumes that anyone cutting sacred sandalwood is doing so systematically, and that all their recent wealth comes from this source." The words hit Bhima like physical blows. Everything he had built, everything he had bought for his family, everything that had lifted them from poverty, all of it could be taken away. "But Captain," he said, his voice cracking, "my family had nothing to do with this. My wife is sick. My children are in school. They don't even know." "The law doesn't distinguish between the criminal and the beneficiaries of the crime," the captain said. "Your family will keep what they owned before your illegal activities began. Everything else becomes property of the state, to be used for forest restoration and protection programs." As they began the journey back toward the village, Bhima's cart now evidence rather than treasure, his mind couldn't grasp the magnitude of what was happening. In a single morning, he had gone from being one of the wealthiest men in the valley to losing everything he had worked and stolen to acquire. But that was only the beginning of his understanding of what justice would demand. Let us pause here in this moment of recognition. Take a breath and feel the ground beneath you. Notice how solid and steady it is, supporting you completely without any effort on your part. Rest in this simple truth. You are held. You are safe. You are exactly where you need to be. The legal proceedings that followed Bhima's arrest moved with the efficient precision of a system that had dealt with such cases before. The networks of merchants who had bought his stolen sandalwood were investigated and dismantled. The profits were traced and calculated. The environmental damage to the sacred grove was assessed by specialists who documented every missing tree, every altered ecosystem, every broken strand in the web of forest life. The numbers were staggering. Over 2 years, Bhima had cut down more than 60 ancient sandalwood trees, including specimens that were estimated to be over 300 years old. The heart of the mountain alone was determined to be nearly 500 years old, making it one of the most ancient trees in the entire mountain region. But it was not just the trees themselves that had been destroyed. The sacred grove had been a unique ecosystem, home to birds and insects found nowhere else in the mountains. Several species that depended on the specific conditions created by old-growth sandalwood forest had lost their only habitat. The interconnected root systems that had stabilized the soil for centuries had been disrupted, leading to erosion that would take decades to repair. The court calculated the total environmental damage at a figure that was nearly impossible for Bhima to comprehend: more gold than he had ever seen in his entire life of cutting trees, more than he could earn in 10 lifetimes of honest work. As the judge explained the sentence, Bhima began to understand the true nature of the trap he had built for himself. Not only would he lose everything he had gained from his crimes, but he would also lose the tools and skills that had previously allowed him to earn an honest living. His house was seized and sold. The land he had bought was transferred to the Forestry Service. The education he had paid for his sons was interrupted when the schools demanded payment of outstanding fees that could no longer be covered. His wife's medicine stopped when he could no longer afford it. But most devastating of all, his woodcutter's tools, the axes and saws and chisels that represented his ability to earn a living through legitimate work, were also confiscated as having been purchased with illegal profits. The court recognizes that this may seem harsh, the judge said, looking directly at Bhima. But the law is designed to ensure that environmental crimes cannot be profitable under any circumstances. You chose to convert sacred trees into personal wealth. Justice now converts your personal wealth back into resources for forest protection. When Bhima was finally released from prison 6 months later, he returned to a family that had fallen back into poverty deeper than what they had known before his crimes began. They had lost not only the wealth he had brought them, but also the respect of their community and the basic security they had once taken for granted. His wife, unable to afford the medicine that had been controlling her illness, had grown sicker. His sons, pulled from their schools and now bearing the shame of their father's crimes, struggled to find anyone willing to teach them or hire them for even the simplest work. And Bhima himself, without tools and with a reputation that made him unemployable in his traditional trade, discovered that his years of secret wealth had cost him the ability to earn honest money. He tried to borrow tools from other woodcutters, but they feared being associated with someone who had violated the sacred trust of the forest. He offered to work for whatever wages anyone would pay, but his neighbors knew that hiring him might bring unwanted attention from the Forest Service. Most painfully, he realized that his expertise, his deep knowledge of the mountain forests and the most valuable trees they contained, was now more curse than gift. Everything he knew about the location of precious woods was knowledge he could never again act upon. His skills had become a source of temptation he could no longer afford to indulge. The man who had once walked through the forest like a master of his domain now moved through the same paths like a ghost, seeing wealth he could not touch, knowing secrets he could not use, carrying skills he could not practice. And in the sacred grove, where he had worked so secretly for 2 years, new trees were being planted. Young sandalwood saplings, protected by fences and guards, growing in the clearings where ancient giants had once stood. They would need a century or more to reach maturity. The prayers and peace that had been concentrated in those old trees would need generations to accumulate again in the new ones. But the trees would eventually grow back. The ecosystem would slowly heal. The sacred grove would once again become whole. Bhima's life, however, remained broken. The man who had thought he could profit from cutting down the sacred had discovered that some things, once cut, cannot be regrown in a single lifetime. Let us rest here for a moment. Breathe gently and feel your body held by the earth beneath you. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to become. Simply be present in this moment of perfect stillness. We will continue this journey together, exploring more teachings about the weight of hidden actions and the wisdom that emerges when we truly understand how every choice creates the conditions for what follows. But for now, simply rest in the truth that you are exactly where you need to be, surrounded by peace that asks nothing of you but your presence. Rest now, and let these teachings settle into your heart like seeds in fertile ground. This story shows us how hidden actions create visible consequences. Bhima discovered that darkness cannot hide what light will eventually reveal. Buddhism teaches that karma is not punishment from outside, but the natural unfolding of cause and effect. When we act in secret believing we can escape the results of our choices, we create the very conditions that ensure those results will find us. The Buddha spoke of this truth often, that there is no place dark enough, no corner remote enough to hide from the consequences of our actions. Not because someone is watching and judging, but because every action plants seeds that must eventually sprout in the conditions we ourselves create. Take a gentle breath now. Feel how your chest rises and falls without any effort from you. Notice how your body knows exactly how to breathe, how to rest, how to simply be. There is nothing you need to control or manage. Simply allow yourself to be held by this moment. Let us explore another story about a silk weaver named Kamala, who believed she could create beauty through deception. In a town known throughout the region for its fine textiles, where the clicking of looms could be heard from every street and the air shimmered with threads of gold and silver, there lived a weaver named Kamala, whose skill with silk was legendary. Her fingers could coax patterns from thread that seemed to dance with their own light. Her fabrics were so beautiful that merchants traveled from distant cities just to see what new marvels she had created. Kamala's workshop sat in the heart of the weaving district, its windows always open so that passers-by could glimpse the magic happening within. She worked at a loom that had been in her family for generations, its wooden frame worn smooth by the hands of her grandmother and great-grandmother, women who had built their reputation through honest work and pure artistry. For years, Kamala had followed the same path as her ancestors. She selected only the finest silk threads, dyed them herself with natural colors that would last for generations, and wove each piece with the patience and precision that true quality demanded. Her saris were worn by brides on their wedding days and passed down as treasures from mother to daughter. Her scarves were sought after by the wealthy families of the capital, who knew that a textile bearing Kamala's mark would retain its beauty and value for decades. But as competition increased and cheaper fabrics began flooding the market from distant workshops that used inferior materials and rushed techniques, Kamala found herself struggling to maintain her prices. Customers who had once paid premium amounts for her work began asking why her pieces cost so much more than similar-looking fabrics they could buy elsewhere. "The threads are different," she would explain. "The dyeing process is different. The time invested is different. These fabrics will last a lifetime." But increasingly, customers seemed more interested in immediate beauty than in lasting quality. They wanted the appearance of fine silk at a fraction of the traditional price. Watching potential buyers walk away from her stall at the market, choosing cheaper alternatives that looked similar to her work, Kamala began to understand that most people could not tell the difference between true quality and clever imitation. They saw color and pattern and texture, but they could not feel the deeper qualities that came from genuine materials and traditional techniques. This realization planted a dangerous seed in her mind. If customers could not distinguish between authentic silk and well-made imitations, if they could not detect the difference between natural dyes and chemical ones, if they cared more about immediate appearance than long-term durability, then why was she limiting herself to the expensive, time-consuming methods her family had always used? At first, she resisted this thinking. Her grandmother had taught her that the integrity of the weaver was woven into every thread, that cutting corners in materials or technique would somehow be visible in the finished work, even if the observer couldn't name exactly what was wrong. But as her savings dwindled and her workshop grew quiet with fewer customers, Kamala began to experiment with small compromises. Instead of using pure silk for the foundation threads that would be hidden beneath the visible surface, she began mixing in cotton threads that were much less expensive but would be invisible in the finished piece. Since no one would see these foundational threads, she reasoned, no one would know the difference. The resulting fabric looked identical to her previous work. The weight was slightly different, and the way it moved in the light was subtly altered. But these were differences that only an expert weaver would notice. When she sold these pieces at her traditional prices, customers were completely satisfied. Encouraged by this success, Kamala began to make other invisible substitutions. She discovered chemical dyes that could mimic the appearance of her traditional natural dyes, but cost a fraction of the price and took days rather than weeks to process properly. She found ways to create patterns that looked hand-woven, but actually incorporated machine-made elements that significantly reduced the time each piece required. Each innovation made her work more profitable, while keeping it apparently identical to her traditional methods. Her customers continued to praise the beauty of her fabrics and recommend her work to their friends. Her reputation remained intact, while her profit margins improved dramatically. Within a year, Kamala had developed a complete system of substitutions and shortcuts that allowed her to produce fabrics that looked like her grandmother's masterpieces, but cost half as much to make and took a quarter of the time to complete. She could afford to lower her prices slightly to attract more customers, while still earning more profit than she had with her traditional methods. The workshop that had been quiet began to hum with activity again. Orders increased. Kamala hired 2 assistants to help with the increased production, teaching them her new hybrid techniques while swearing them to secrecy about the specific methods she used. But success built on deception has a way of demanding greater deceptions to sustain itself. As word spread about Kamala's apparently improved prices and continued quality, she began receiving orders from wealthy families who specifically requested her traditional ancestral weaving methods. They were willing to pay premium prices specifically because they believed they were purchasing textiles made with the same techniques and materials that had made her family famous for generations. These customers weren't just buying fabric, they were buying authenticity, heritage, the knowledge that they owned something made in the old way by someone who carried forward an ancient tradition. Faced with these orders, Kamala could have returned to her original methods for these special commissions. But the old techniques now seemed impossibly slow and expensive. She had grown accustomed to the efficiency of her new methods and the profits they generated. The idea of spending weeks on natural dyeing processes and hand-weaving every thread seemed like a waste of time when she could create visually identical results so much more quickly. Instead, she decided to expand her deceptions. She created special labels for these premium orders, describing in detail the traditional methods supposedly used in their creation. She spoke eloquently to customers about honoring her grandmother's legacy and maintaining the ancient standards of quality. She even began charging prices higher than her grandmother had ever commanded, justifying these costs by emphasizing the rarity and authenticity of truly traditional methods in the modern world. The irony was that as Kamala became more dishonest about her methods, she also became more skilled at explaining and celebrating the honest methods she was no longer using. Her knowledge of traditional techniques, gained through years of authentic practice, made her descriptions of these processes more convincing than someone who had never actually learned them could ever be. Customers trusted her completely. They brought friends to meet the last weaver who still works in the old way. They paid premium prices gladly, knowing they were supporting traditional craftsmanship and acquiring textiles that were made with the patience and materials their grandmothers would have recognized. But textiles, unlike some other goods, have a way of revealing their true nature over time. Let us pause in this unfolding and take a gentle breath. Feel the air entering and leaving your body with perfect natural rhythm. Notice how your shoulders can soften, how your hands can rest completely. There is nothing you need to figure out, nothing you need to fix. Simply be here in this moment of rest. The first signs of trouble appeared about 2 years after Kamala had fully implemented her system of deceptions. A wealthy merchant's wife brought back a sari that Kamala had woven for her daughter's wedding, claiming there was something wrong with the fabric. "Look at these threads," the woman said, pointing to areas where the sari had begun to show wear. "They're breaking down differently than they should, and the color is fading in strange patterns." Kamala examined the sari carefully. What she saw made her stomach tighten with recognition. The cotton threads she had mixed with the silk were wearing at a different rate, creating subtle but visible lines in the fabric where the two materials were breaking down at different speeds. The chemical dyes, which had looked identical to natural ones when fresh, were fading in ways that created muddy, uneven patches of color. "This sometimes happens with very delicate fabrics," Kamala said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Silk can be unpredictable, especially in certain climates." But even as she spoke, she knew the explanation was inadequate. The problems visible in this sari were not the natural aging patterns of pure silk dyed with traditional methods. They were the specific degradation patterns of mixed materials and chemical processes. "My grandmother's saris are 50 years old and still beautiful," the merchant's wife said. "This one is barely 2 years old and falling apart. Something is different." Kamala offered to repair the sari free of charge, but she knew that repairs would only postpone the inevitable. The fundamental mismatch between her materials would continue to manifest as the fabric aged. Over the following months, more customers began returning with similar complaints. Saris that should have lasted for generations were showing signs of wear after just a few years. Scarves that had been purchased as heirlooms were developing problems that made them unsuitable for special occasions. Each complaint required careful handling. Kamala had to acknowledge that there were problems while deflecting questions about why these problems were occurring. She offered replacements, repairs, and partial refunds, but she could not offer honest explanations without revealing the extent of her deceptions. More troubling than the individual complaints, however, was the pattern they revealed. The customers who were having problems were specifically those who had paid the highest prices for supposedly traditional work. The fabrics that were failing were the ones she had labeled as made with ancestral methods and sold as premium heirloom pieces. The cheaper pieces, which customers had purchased, knowing they were getting simplified versions of her work, were actually holding up better because customers' expectations were lower and they treated these pieces as everyday items rather than precious textiles. But the expensive pieces, sold as investments and treasures, were revealing themselves to be neither. Word began to spread through the network of wealthy families who were Kamala's primary customers for premium work. These families knew each other, socialized together, and often displayed their finest textiles at the same gatherings and celebrations. When multiple families began experiencing similar problems with expensive pieces purchased from the same weaver, the coincidence became a topic of concerned conversation. Mrs. Sharma, whose daughter's wedding sari had developed visible flaws just months after the ceremony, met Mrs. Patel at a religious festival where Mrs. Patel was wearing a Kamala scarf that showed obvious signs of uneven fading. "I thought I was the only one having problems with Kamala's work," Mrs. Sharma said quietly. "So did I," Mrs. Patel replied. "But now I'm wondering if there's something we don't know about her methods." These conversations led to a more systematic examination of Kamala's recent work. Several families brought their pieces to an elderly weaver named Master Krishnan, a man who had trained alongside Kamala's grandmother and was known for his ability to identify different materials and techniques just by touch. Master Krishnan's examination was thorough and damning. "These pieces contain cotton mixed with silk," he announced after examining the first few pieces. "The dyes are chemical, not plant-based. The weaving incorporates machine elements. These are not traditional textiles. They are imitations of traditional textiles." The families who had commissioned these pieces were not just disappointed, they were furious. They had paid traditional prices specifically to support traditional methods. They had trusted Kamala's reputation and her explicit claims about her techniques. They had purchased these textiles as investments and heirlooms, objects that would retain their beauty and value for generations. Instead, they had received clever counterfeits that were designed to look like authentic work while being made with inferior materials and shortcuts. But the consequences extended beyond the immediate customers. Master Krishnan, troubled by what he had discovered, began examining other recent work from weavers throughout the district. If Kamala, who came from one of the most respected weaving families, was using deceptive practices, how many other weavers might be doing the same? What he found was a pattern of corner cutting and material substitution that had infected much of the traditional weaving community. Faced with competition from machine-made textiles and pressure to reduce prices, many weavers had begun incorporating similar shortcuts while maintaining claims of authenticity. The discovery created a crisis of confidence in the entire textile district. Customers who had trusted local weavers for generations suddenly questioned whether any of the traditional work they were buying was actually made with traditional methods. Sales dropped dramatically as buyers became suspicious of claims about hand weaving and natural materials. The reputation that had taken generations to build, the trust between weavers and customers that allowed traditional crafts to survive in a modern economy, began to unravel as quickly as the flawed textiles that had exposed the deception. Let us take another gentle breath here. Feel your body settling more deeply into rest. Notice how the ground beneath you supports you completely, asking nothing in return. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to understand. Simply rest in this perfect moment. The crisis in the textile district reached a turning point when the Regional Craft Guild announced they would be conducting a formal investigation into the authenticity claims made by local weavers. Master Krishnan had agreed to lead the investigation, using his expertise to examine samples from every workshop and determine which weavers were accurately representing their methods and materials. For Kamala, this announcement was devastating news. She knew that any careful examination of her recent work would reveal the full extent of her deceptions. Not only would she be exposed as dishonest, but the investigation would likely uncover the systematic nature of her substitutions and the deliberate way she had misrepresented premium pieces to unsuspecting customers. She considered confessing before the investigation could expose her, but she realized that confession would not protect her from the consequences of what she had done. The customers who had paid premium prices for supposedly traditional work would still demand compensation. The reputation she had built would still be destroyed. The trust of the weaving community would still be broken. Instead, she decided to try one final deception. Working frantically, Kamala began producing new samples using genuine traditional methods. She purchased the finest silk threads, prepared natural dyes using processes she had abandoned years earlier, and wove several small pieces with the authentic techniques her grandmother had taught her. Her plan was to submit these authentic samples to the guild investigation while claiming they represented her standard methods. She hoped that Master Krishnan would examine these pieces, find them genuine, and clear her name without investigating the older work that contained all the problematic substitutions. But Kamala had forgotten something crucial about Master Krishnan's expertise. He had been examining textiles for more than 50 years. He could not only identify materials and techniques, but he could also estimate the age of a piece based on subtle characteristics of the threads, dyes, and weaving patterns. When Kamala presented her authentic samples to the investigation, Master Krishnan examined them carefully and nodded approvingly. "These are beautiful pieces," he said, "clearly made with traditional methods and materials. Your grandmother would be proud of this work." Kamala felt a moment of relief, thinking her strategy had succeeded. But then Master Krishnan continued, "Of course, these pieces were made very recently, within the last few weeks, I would estimate. What I'm curious about is why your recent work is so different from the pieces you were producing a year or two ago." He reached into his bag and brought out several samples that Kamala recognized with horror. They were pieces from the faulty textiles that customers had brought to him for examination. "These pieces, which carry your mark and were sold as traditional work, tell a very different story about your methods," he said quietly. "Would you like to explain the discrepancy?" Faced with direct evidence of her deceptions laid out beside authentic examples of her own recent work, Kamala found that further lies were impossible. The contrast between what she claimed to do and what she had actually been doing was too obvious to deny or explain away. But confession, she discovered, brought no relief. The weight of her deceptions had grown so heavy that admitting them felt like being crushed rather than freed. The guild's final report documented not just the extent of Kamala's deceptions, but their systematic nature. She had not simply cut a few corners or made a few mistakes. She had deliberately developed methods designed to deceive customers while maximizing profits. She had specifically targeted the most trusting customers, those who paid premium prices specifically to support traditional methods, with the most deceptive practices. The consequences were swift and comprehensive. The guild revoked her certification and removed her from their directory of approved traditional weavers. The customers who had been deceived filed formal complaints demanding full refunds for pieces that had been misrepresented. The local merchant association banned her from participating in markets and festivals where authentic crafts were promoted. But most devastating of all, her reputation spread beyond the immediate community. The story of her deceptions became a cautionary tale told throughout the regional weaving networks. Other districts, concerned about protecting their own reputations, began refusing to work with any weaver from her area unless they could provide extensive documentation of their authenticity. The deception that had begun as a way to compete more effectively had ended by making competition impossible. The shortcuts that had promised greater profits had led to the complete loss of her ability to profit from her skills at all. Kamala's workshop, once busy with orders and assistance, grew quiet again. But this time, the silence was not the temporary lull of a changing market. It was the permanent stillness of a livelihood that had been destroyed by the very person who had depended on it. She still possessed all the skills her grandmother had taught her. She could still create genuinely beautiful textiles using authentic traditional methods. But the trust required to sell such work, the confidence customers needed to believe that what they were buying was what they were being told they were buying, had been destroyed beyond repair. The woman who had thought she could weave deception into beauty discovered that honesty, once unraveled, cannot be rewoven in a single lifetime. This story shows us how deception creates its own destruction. Kamala discovered that authenticity cannot be imitated indefinitely. Truth has a way of revealing itself over time. Buddhism teaches that right livelihood means earning our living through means that harm neither others nor ourselves. When we build our prosperity on false foundations, we create the conditions for that prosperity to collapse. The Buddha spoke often about the interconnection between our actions and their consequences, especially in how we relate to others. Kamala's customers trusted her not just with their money, but with their desire to support authentic tradition and create lasting beauty. When we betray such trust for temporary gain, we damage not only our relationship with others, but our ability to trust ourselves. Take a gentle breath now. Feel how naturally your body knows to inhale and exhale, how it maintains this rhythm without any effort from your conscious mind. There is a wisdom in this automatic breathing that mirrors the automatic unfolding of cause and effect in our lives. Rest in this natural rhythm, this effortless being. Let us explore another story about a merchant named Arjun, who thought he could profit by selling hope to the desperate. Rest now and allow these teachings to settle into your heart, like morning dew settling onto leaves. There's nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to analyze. The wisdom these stories carry will find its way into your understanding in its own time, in its own way. Simply rest in the quiet truth that consequences unfold naturally from actions, that honesty creates lasting foundation, that authentic living, though sometimes more difficult, builds something that time cannot destroy. Be here now in this moment of perfect peace, surrounded by truths that ask nothing of you but your gentle attention. In a bustling trading city where merchants from distant lands gathered to exchange goods and stories, where the air was thick with the scent of spices and the sound of bargaining voices filled every marketplace, there lived a merchant named Arjun, whose reputation for finding rare medicines had made him wealthy beyond his humble beginnings. Arjun had started his career as a simple trader in common goods, grains, textiles, basic tools that farmers and craftsmen needed for their daily work. But he possessed a gift for languages and an intuitive understanding of what people truly wanted, skills that allowed him to build relationships with suppliers and customers across vast networks of trade routes. Over the years, he had gradually specialized in medicinal herbs and preparations, learning to identify the plants and compounds that healers sought for treating various ailments. His warehouse contained carefully organized stores of dried roots, powdered leaves, rare minerals, and prepared tinctures that physicians and traditional healers would travel great distances to obtain. Arjun's success came from his ability to connect suffering people with genuine remedies, He maintained relationships with healers in mountain villages who gathered rare plants, with coastal traders who imported healing substances from distant islands, with monastery gardens where monks cultivated medicinal herbs with generations of accumulated knowledge. His customers trusted him because he was honest about what his medicines could and could not do. When someone came seeking a cure for their child's fever, he would provide herbs that could reduce the fever and ease suffering, but he would not promise miraculous healing. When families sought treatments for chronic conditions, he would offer remedies that might provide relief while being clear about the limitations of what any medicine could accomplish. This honesty had built him a reputation that extended far beyond his immediate city. People would make long journeys specifically to buy medicines from Arjun because they knew he would not sell them false hope along with expensive herbs. But success in the medicine trade also exposed Arjun daily to human desperation in its rawest form. Parents arrived at his shop carrying children wasted by diseases that had not responded to any treatment. Elderly people came seeking something, anything, that might ease the pain that had become their constant companion. Young adults, struck down by illnesses that threatened to steal their futures, begged for medicines that could restore what seemed lost forever. The weight of this desperation was something Arjun had learned to carry carefully. He understood that for many of his customers, his shop represented their last hope. They came to him after exhausting other options, often spending their final savings on medicines that might or might not provide the relief they desperately needed. For years, Arjun had handled this responsibility with careful compassion. He would listen to their stories, examine their symptoms as best he could, and recommend treatments based on his knowledge and experience. When he didn't have anything that might help, he would say so honestly, sometimes referring people to healers in other cities who might have different knowledge or access to different medicines. But the constant exposure to desperation began to affect him in ways he didn't initially recognize. He started to notice how people's faces would change when he told them he had something that might help, the way hope would return to eyes that had grown dull with suffering, the way shoulders would straighten when someone believed relief might be possible. He also began to understand the enormous power he held in these moments. A word of encouragement from him could transform a family's entire outlook. A suggestion that a particular medicine had helped others with similar conditions could restore hope that had been nearly extinguished. This power was seductive. Arjun found himself increasingly focused on the moment when despair transformed into hope, rather than on the longer-term question of whether that hope would be justified by actual results. The change in his practice began subtly. When customers asked about medicines for conditions he knew were essentially incurable, instead of saying, "I don't have anything that will help with that," he began saying, "I have something that might help." The difference seemed small, but it opened a door that would eventually lead to much larger deceptions. The first significant step down this path came when a man named Vishnu arrived at Arjun's shop, carrying his teenage daughter, a girl so thin and weak that she could barely hold her head up. The local healers had given up on her case, saying her condition was beyond their knowledge. Vishnu had sold his farm and possessions to pay for treatments that had provided no improvement. "Please," Vishnu said, tears streaming down his face. "She is my only child. Tell me you have something that can help her." Arjun examined the girl and recognized symptoms he had seen before, signs of a wasting disease that attacked the body's ability to absorb nutrition from food. He had encountered this condition several times over the years and knew that while some herbal treatments could sometimes slow its progress, there was no cure. Most people who developed this disease died within months, regardless of treatment. The honest response would have been to explain this to Vishnu, while offering the few treatments that might provide some comfort during the girl's remaining time. But looking at the desperate father and the dying child, Arjun found he could not speak those words. Instead, he found himself saying, "This is a difficult condition, but I have treated cases like this before. There is a rare preparation that has shown remarkable results with similar symptoms." It was technically true. He had treated similar cases before, though none successfully. And there was a rare preparation he sometimes used for wasting diseases, though it had never produced the remarkable results he was implying. "How much?" Vishnu asked immediately. "Whatever the cost, I will find a way to pay." The preparation Arjun was thinking of was indeed expensive. The ingredients were rare, and the process of creating it was time-consuming, but it was no more expensive than other treatments he regularly sold. However, seeing Vishnu's desperate eagerness to pay any amount for hope, Arjun found himself inflating the price significantly. "Such treatments are costly," he said. "The ingredients alone cost more than most people can afford, but for a case this serious, I would need at least 3 times my usual fee to cover the special preparation required." Vishnu didn't hesitate. "I will pay anything. When can you have it ready?" As Arjun prepared the expensive treatment, he told himself that he was providing real medicine, not selling false hope. The preparation did contain herbs that had traditionally been used for wasting diseases. If it didn't work, that was the limitation of medicine itself, not any deception on his part. But privately, he knew he was crossing a line. He was charging a desperate man far more than the treatment was worth, while implying success rates that he knew were unrealistic. He was profiting from desperation rather than simply providing honest service to suffering. The girl's condition did not improve. Over the following weeks, she continued to weaken despite the expensive treatment. When Vishnu returned, carrying his daughter, who was now even more frail than before, his face showed the terrible weight of hope that had been building toward inevitable disappointment. "The medicine doesn't seem to be working," he said quietly. Arjun could have acknowledged the failure and offered comfort for the family's remaining time together. Instead, he found himself suggesting that the treatment needed more time to work, that the girl's condition was more advanced than he had initially realized, that they should try a different preparation that might be more effective. Each suggestion came with additional costs. Each new treatment carried implied promises of effectiveness that Arjun knew were unlikely to be fulfilled. Each interaction deepened Vishnu's investment, both financial and emotional, in the belief that his daughter could be saved if they just found the right combination of medicines. The girl died 6 weeks later, after her father had spent not just the proceeds from selling his farm, but had also borrowed against future earnings from relatives and neighbors. Vishnu had spent his daughter's final weeks focused on obtaining expensive treatments rather than simply being present with her as she prepared to leave this world. At the funeral, Arjun saw the complete devastation his deceptions had created. Not only had Vishnu lost his beloved daughter, but he had also lost his livelihood, his savings, and his ability to support himself in his old age. The false hope Arjun had sold had prevented the family from accepting their situation and finding peace in their remaining time together. But instead of recognizing this tragedy as a warning about the dangers of his new approach, Arjun told himself that he had done everything possible to help. The girl's death was not his fault. She had been dying when she arrived. He had provided genuine medicines and legitimate treatments. If they hadn't worked, that was the limitation of medical knowledge, not his responsibility. This self-justification allowed him to continue down the path he had begun. but with more sophisticated methods and larger profits. Let us pause here and breathe gently. Feel your body resting, supported completely by whatever holds you. There is nothing you need to solve or understand right now. Simply notice how your breath moves naturally, how your heart beats steadily, how you are held by this moment without effort. Rest in this simple truth of being. Word of Arjun's willingness to treat hopeless cases began to spread through networks of desperate families. People who had exhausted conventional treatments started making long journeys to his shop, bringing their most difficult cases and their life savings in hope of finding cures that had eluded other healers. Arjun developed a system for handling these desperate customers that maximized both their hope and his profits. He would listen carefully to their stories, examine their symptoms, and then retreat to his private office to consult. What he told them were rare medical texts and correspondence with healers from distant lands. During these consultations, which were actually periods when he calculated how much money each customer might be able to pay, Arjun would emerge with carefully crafted explanations of their loved one's condition. He had learned to speak with confidence about complex-sounding syndromes and rare disorders, using medical terminology that impressed families while avoiding specific promises that could later be proven false. Your son's condition appears to be a form of wasting syndrome combined with nervous system involvement, he might explain to worried parents. This is quite rare, but I have correspondence with a healer in the mountain regions who has developed a specialized treatment protocol that has shown significant success with similar presentations. None of this was entirely false. Medical conditions were indeed complex and often involved multiple systems. There were healers in mountain regions who had developed various treatments. The phrase "significant success" was vague enough to mean almost anything. But the overall impression created by these explanations was that Arjun had specific knowledge about the customer's exact condition and access to treatments that other healers lacked. Families left these consultations believing they had found someone who truly understood their situation and could provide remedies unavailable elsewhere. The treatments themselves became increasingly elaborate and expensive. Arjun would create complex protocols involving multiple medicines taken at specific times, dietary restrictions that required purchasing special foods available only through his network of suppliers, and treatment schedules that extended over many months. These lengthy treatment plans served multiple purposes. They maximized the total amount each customer would spend. They provided built-in explanations for why improvements might not be immediately visible. The protocols were complex and needed time to work properly, and they created ongoing relationships that allowed Arjun to adjust his approach based on each customer's financial capacity and level of desperation. Families would often mortgage their homes, sell family heirlooms, or take loans from relatives to pay for these extended treatment programs. Arjun had developed a keen ability to sense how much money people could access and would adjust his treatment recommendations accordingly. For wealthy families, he would prescribe medicines supposedly made from the rarest ingredients: ground pearls, gold leaf preparations, herbs that grew only in certain seasons on specific mountainsides. These treatments could cost more than most people earned in a year. For middle-class families, he would recommend more modest but still expensive combinations of treatments, often suggesting that their loved one's condition was fortunately less severe than some cases he had seen, requiring less rare but still costly interventions. Even for poor families, he found ways to extract significant payments by offering simplified versions of his premium treatments, payment plans that kept them indebted to him for months or years, or by suggesting that their loved one's condition was still treatable, but required immediate action that could not be delayed by financial concerns. The most insidious aspect of Arjun's system was how he handled treatment failures. When patients didn't improve, which was the case with most of the genuinely hopeless conditions he was now claiming to treat, he had developed a repertoire of explanations that maintained hope while generating additional revenue. Sometimes the patient's condition was more advanced than initially apparent, requiring stronger medicines and longer treatment. Sometimes the patient wasn't following the protocol precisely enough, necessitating additional consultations and adjustments. Sometimes the condition was complicated by secondary issues that required supplementary treatments. In cases where patients actually got worse despite expensive treatments, Arjun would explain that this was sometimes a necessary part of the healing process, that the medicines were working to eliminate toxins or rebalance energies in ways that could temporarily increase symptoms before improvement began. These explanations were particularly cruel because they convinced suffering families that their loved ones' increased pain or weakness was actually a sign of progress, encouraging them to continue expensive treatments even when those treatments might be causing additional harm. Over 3 years, Arjun's new approach made him wealthier than he had ever imagined possible. His shop expanded into a complex of buildings housing his consultation rooms, preparation laboratories, and warehouses full of expensive ingredients. He employed assistants to handle routine customers, while he focused on the most profitable, desperate cases. His reputation grew throughout the region as someone who could treat conditions that baffled other healers. Families would travel for weeks to reach him, often selling everything they owned to pay for transportation and treatment. Some villages became familiar with his name as the place desperate people went when they had exhausted all local options. But Arjun's success was built on the accumulated suffering of hundreds of families who had spent their life savings on false hope. Behind the impressive exterior of his expanded business lay a growing foundation of tragedy. Children who had died while their parents focused on expensive treatments rather than spending their final time together. Adults who had passed away having bankrupted their families in pursuit of impossible cures. Elderly people who had died in poverty after spending their savings on medicines that provided no relief. The weight of this accumulating harm was something Arjun had learned to avoid thinking about directly. He focused on the medicine he was providing, the hope he was offering, the genuine effort he was making to help people who had been abandoned by other healers. But that weight was still there, growing larger, with each desperate family who trusted him with their savings and their hope, building toward an inevitable reckoning that would be as unavoidable as the consequences faced by all those who profit from others' deepest vulnerabilities. Let us take another gentle breath here. Feel how your body knows exactly how to breathe without any guidance from your mind. Notice how you are supported right now, how this moment contains everything you need. There is nothing to fix, nothing to solve, nothing to become. Simply rest in the perfect completeness of being exactly where you are. The beginning of Arjun's downfall came from an unexpected source, his own success. As his reputation spread and more desperate families sought his services, he began treating multiple people from the same communities. Villages that had sent 1 or 2 families to him over the years were now sending several families each month, all seeking cures for conditions their local healers couldn't address. This concentration of patients from the same areas created something Arjun hadn't anticipated. Communities of people who could compare their experiences with his treatments and share information about the results they were seeing. In a mountain village called Dharampur, 4 different families had spent enormous sums on Arjun's treatments over the course of 2 years. The Sharma family had mortgaged their land to pay for treatments for their son's mysterious illness. The Patels had sold their shop to fund medicines for their daughter's condition. the Kumars had borrowed against future harvests to pay for their father's treatments. The Mehtas had spent their entire dowry fund on preparations for their infant syndrome. All 4 families had been given elaborate treatment protocols. All had been told their conditions were rare but treatable. All had been encouraged to continue treatments even when initial results were disappointing. All had spent far more money than they could afford based on Arjun's assurances that persistence with his methods would eventually yield results. And in every case, the patient had either shown no improvement or had actually gotten worse, despite months of expensive treatments. The tragedy might have remained isolated to individual families, if not for a festival celebration where all 4 families found themselves gathered in the same place, sharing their experiences with each other for the first time. What emerged from their conversations was a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Not only had all 4 families received essentially the same expensive treatments, despite having supposedly different rare conditions, but Arjun's explanations for treatment failures had been nearly identical across all cases. When the Sharma boy hadn't improved, they had been told his condition was more advanced than initially apparent. When the Patel girl had gotten worse, they had been told this was part of the healing process. When the Kumar father had shown no response to treatment, they had been told the medicines needed more time to work properly. When the Mehta infant had declined further, they had been told that additional complications required supplementary treatments. The families realized they had been told essentially the same stories, given essentially the same treatments, and charged essentially the same enormous fees for conditions that Arjun had claimed were completely different from each other. But what disturbed them most was comparing these experiences to what had happened to other families in neighboring villages who had never sought Arjun's expensive treatments. Several people with similar conditions had been treated by local healers using simple, inexpensive methods. While not all of these people had recovered, they hadn't suffered the additional decline that seemed to characterize those who had undergone Arjun's intensive protocols. The 4 families decided to visit the regional medical college, where traditional healers worked alongside younger practitioners who had studied both ancient and modern approaches to medicine. They brought samples of the medicines Arjun had provided, along with detailed descriptions of the treatments they had received. Dr. Mohan, an elderly physician who had spent decades studying both traditional and contemporary medicine, examined the samples and reviewed the treatment protocols. His analysis was troubling. "These medicines are not harmful," he explained to the families, "but they are also not particularly specific to the conditions you describe. Most of these preparations are general tonics, things that might help anyone feel slightly better, but are not targeted treatments for serious illnesses." He paused, studying the elaborate treatment schedules Arjun had provided. More concerning is that these protocols seem designed more to create ongoing dependency than to achieve specific healing outcomes. Look at how they're structured: complex timing requirements, multiple medicines that must be taken together, dietary restrictions that require purchasing special foods. This creates a system where patients must keep returning for more guidance and more supplies. But he told us these were specialized treatments for rare conditions, Mrs. Sharma said. He said he had correspondence with healers who had developed these protocols specifically. Dr. Mohan nodded gravely. "I know most of the traditional healers in this region, and I'm familiar with the mountain practitioners he claims to correspond with. None of them have developed the specific protocols he describes. What you've been sold are expensive versions of common remedies, presented as if they were specialized treatments." The implications of this revelation extended far beyond the immediate families. If Arjun had deceived them so systematically, How many other desperate families had received similar treatment? How many people had spent their life savings on false hope disguised as specialized medicine? Dr. Mohan agreed to help the families document their experiences and file formal complaints with the regional trade authorities. But he also warned them that proving deception in medicine was often difficult, especially when the practitioner was careful to avoid making specific promises that could be definitively proven false. He was very clever about how he spoke to us, Mrs. Patel realized as they prepared their complaint. He never promised our daughter would be cured. He only suggested that his treatments had shown significant success with similar cases. And he never said the medicines would definitely work, Mr. Kumar added. Only that they might help, and that we should give them time to see results. This careful use of language had protected Arjun legally, while creating the emotional impression of confident expertise. Families had heard what they desperately wanted to hear, that someone understood their situation and had effective treatments available, while he had technically only offered possibilities and suggestions. But language that protected against legal consequences could not protect against the deeper reckoning that was approaching. Let us rest here for a moment, breathing softly and feeling the ground beneath us. There is wisdom in pausing, in allowing space for understanding to deepen naturally. Your body knows how to be still, how to simply exist without effort. Rest in that knowing, that effortless presence that requires nothing from you but your gentle attention. The formal investigation into Arjun's practices began quietly, as regulatory inquiries often do. Trade authorities interviewed the families who had filed complaints, documented their experiences, and began reviewing the medicines and protocols they had received. They also started identifying other customers who had purchased similar treatments, gradually building a picture of the scope of Arjun's operations. But Arjun was unaware of this investigation during its early stages. His business continued to flourish, with new, desperate families arriving regularly, seeking help for conditions that had defeated other healers. He had grown so confident in his approach that he no longer felt the anxiety he had experienced during his first deceptions. The system he had developed seemed foolproof, legally protected, financially profitable, and emotionally satisfying for customers who left his shop feeling hopeful. The first sign of trouble came when several families stopped returning for follow-up treatments. Arjun had grown accustomed to customers who continued their protocols for many months, generating steady revenue through ongoing purchases of medicines and consultation fees. When multiple families suddenly stopped coming, he initially assumed they had run out of money or had decided to discontinue treatment for other reasons. But then he began receiving unusual questions from some of his current customers. People who had previously accepted his explanations without question were now asking for more specific information about the success rates of his treatments, the exact qualifications of the mountain healers he corresponded with, and the scientific basis for the complex protocols he recommended. These questions suggested that someone was encouraging his customers to be more skeptical of his claims, though he couldn't immediately identify the source of this new scrutiny. The truth became clear when two trade authority investigators arrived at his shop, presenting official documents that authorized them to examine his records, interview his staff, and take samples of his medicines for analysis. We're investigating complaints about potentially deceptive practices in the sale of medical treatments, the lead investigator explained. We need to review your patient records, treatment protocols, and correspondence with other healers. Arjun's first impulse was to deny any wrongdoing while providing the requested cooperation. He had always been careful to maintain detailed records that could support his claims if challenged. His treatment notes documented the symptoms patients presented, the medicines he had provided, and the explanations he had given for various outcomes. But as he reviewed these records with the investigators, Arjun began to see his practices from an outside perspective for the first time. The patterns that had seemed reasonable when he was focused on individual cases became obviously problematic when viewed as a whole. Nearly every patient he had treated for rare conditions had received similar combinations of expensive general tonics. The correspondence with mountain healers he had claimed to base his treatments on consisted of a few old letters about common herbal preparations, nothing that supported the specialized protocols he had been prescribing. Most damaging of all, his records showed a clear correlation between patients' apparent financial capacity and the complexity and cost of the treatments he had recommended. Wealthy families had consistently been diagnosed with conditions requiring the most expensive interventions, while poor families had been given diagnoses that justified less costly but still profitable treatment plans. The investigators also discovered that Arjun had been purchasing his medicines from standard suppliers at normal wholesale prices, then charging patients for rare ingredients and specialized preparation at markups that often exceeded 1,000% of his actual costs. Can you explain why families with very different symptoms received essentially identical treatment protocols? The lead investigator asked, pointing to several cases where patients with supposedly unrelated conditions had been given the same medicines in the same proportions. Arjun attempted to explain that many conditions had underlying similarities that justified similar treatments, but his explanation sounded hollow when confronted with the systematic nature of the pattern. He had been operating more like someone selling expensive hope than someone providing individualized medical care. The investigation also revealed the human cost of his deceptions. The authorities had tracked down dozens of families who had been treated by Arjun over the past 3 years. Many had spent their life savings on treatments that provided no benefit. Several had delayed seeking effective care for treatable conditions because they believed Arjun's expensive protocols were addressing their problems. Most tragically, some patients had died while undergoing his treatments, with families spending their loved ones' final months focused on complex medical protocols rather than providing comfort and connection during the dying process. We estimate that your practices have extracted over 2 million rupees from desperate families over the past 3 years, the investigator informed him. Money that these families spent believing they were purchasing effective treatments for serious medical conditions. As the full scope of the investigation became clear, Arjun realized that his system of careful language and legal protection would not shield him from the consequences of what he had done. The evidence of systematic deception was overwhelming, and the harm to vulnerable families was documented in heartbreaking detail. But even facing this reckoning, Arjun struggled to fully acknowledge the magnitude of his betrayal. He told himself that he had provided real medicines to desperate people, that he had offered hope where other healers had given up, that the families had chosen to spend their money on treatments he had never guaranteed would work. The man who had thought he could profit indefinitely from human desperation was about to discover that some forms of exploitation create consequences that extend far beyond legal penalties, touching every aspect of the life he had built on others' suffering. The legal proceedings that followed were swift but thorough. The trade authorities had built their case carefully, documenting not just the deceptive practices, but the systematic nature of Arjun's exploitation of vulnerable families. The court reviewed testimony from dozens of customers, examined the medicines he had sold, and analyzed the enormous gap between his costs and the prices he had charged. But the most damning evidence came from Arjun's own records. His meticulous documentation, which he had maintained to protect himself, instead revealed the calculated nature of his deceptions. The court could see how he had tailored his diagnoses to match families' financial capacity, how he had used identical treatments for supposedly different rare conditions, how he had prolonged expensive protocols even when patients were clearly not improving. The judge's final statement captured the essence of what Arjun had done. The defendant exploited the most vulnerable moment in these families' lives, when they faced the possible loss of a loved one, to extract maximum profit through deliberate deception. This represents not just fraud, but a profound violation of the trust that must exist between those who provide healing services and those who seek them. The financial penalties were severe. Arjun was required to refund every payment he had received from customers who could prove they had been deceived, plus additional compensation for the harm his delays had caused to patients who might have received effective treatment elsewhere. But the money to pay these refunds had to come from selling everything Arjun had acquired during his years of deceptive practices. His expanded shop, his warehouses full of expensive medicines, his comfortable home, his investments. All were seized and liquidated to compensate the families he had exploited. When the accounting was complete, Arjun discovered that his deceptions had cost him more than just the illegal profits. The legal fees, court costs, and additional penalties meant that he had lost everything he had earned during his entire career as a merchant, including the legitimate wealth he had accumulated through honest practices in his earlier years. The man who had thought he could build lasting prosperity by exploiting desperation found himself poorer than when he had started his business decades before. But financial ruin was only the beginning of the consequences that would follow him. News of the court case spread quickly through the networks of traders and healers throughout the region. Arjun's name became synonymous with medical fraud, a cautionary tale told in medical colleges and traditional healing schools about the dangers of prioritizing profit over patient welfare. More personally devastating was the reaction of the healing community he had once been part of. Traditional healers who had known and respected him during his honest years felt betrayed not just by his individual actions, but by the damage he had done to the reputation of their entire field. "He has made people suspicious of all of us," explained Master Devi, an elderly healer who had once recommended patients to Arjun's shop. Now, when families come seeking help for serious conditions, they wonder if we are also trying to exploit their desperation. The trust that took generations to build has been damaged by one person's greed. The suppliers who had provided Arjun with genuine medicines during his honest years refused to work with him, knowing that association with his name could damage their own reputations. The customers who had trusted him with routine purchases now questioned whether they had ever received fair value, even from transactions that had been completely legitimate. Most painfully, the healers he had once genuinely helped, those who had relied on his knowledge and connections to obtain rare medicines for their patients, could no longer work with him without appearing to endorse his discredited practices. Arjun found himself completely isolated from the profession that had been his life's work. He possessed extensive knowledge about medicinal plants, deep relationships with suppliers across vast trade networks, and decades of experience in identifying and preparing therapeutic compounds. But this expertise had become unusable because no one could trust that he would apply it honestly. The man who had corrupted his profession for profit discovered that corruption had cost him the ability to practice his profession at all. Desperate and essentially unemployable in his chosen field, Arjun attempted to find other work. But his case had been widely reported, and his name was recognizable throughout the trading communities where his skills might have been applicable. Potential employers worried that hiring someone known for deceptive practices would damage their own credibility with customers and suppliers. He tried using different names, moving to distant cities where his reputation might not have preceded him, even attempting to work as a simple laborer in markets where his knowledge of medicines would not be relevant. But the trading networks he had once been part of extended across vast distances, and word of his practices had spread wherever merchants gathered to share information about suppliers and customers. The interconnected community that had once been the source of his success became the instrument of his permanent exile from commerce. Years passed. Arjun aged from a successful middle-aged merchant to an elderly man struggling to survive on the margins of the economy he had once dominated. His hair turned gray, his hands grew rough from manual labor, his clothes became worn and patched. Sometimes, walking through markets where he had once been welcomed as a valued supplier, he would see healers examining medicines, families seeking treatments for sick children, merchants negotiating prices for therapeutic compounds. The conversations he overheard reminded him of knowledge he still possessed but could no longer use. Insights about quality and sourcing that could help these people avoid inferior products, expertise that could guide them toward more effective treatments. But he could not offer this help without revealing who he was. And revealing who he was would only create suspicion about his motives, concern that he was attempting some new form of deception. The wisdom he had accumulated through decades of honest practice had become as inaccessible to others as it was useless to himself. In his old age, living in a small rented room far from the prosperous trading district where he had once owned property, Arjun would sometimes encounter families seeking medical help for desperate situations similar to those he had once exploited. He would see the same hope and fear in their eyes, the same willingness to sacrifice everything for a chance to save someone they loved. These encounters were the most painful reminders of what he had done. He knew that somewhere in the markets these families would visit, there might be merchants who would exploit their desperation as he had once done. He understood better than anyone how such exploitation worked, what warning signs families should watch for, how they could protect themselves from deceptive practices. But he could not warn them without explaining how he had acquired such detailed knowledge of medical fraud. He could not protect them without confessing that he had once been the kind of person they needed protection from. The man who had possessed the expertise to help desperate families avoid deception was prevented by his own history of deception from offering that help to anyone. Let us pause here and breathe gently into this moment. Feel your body resting, supported by the earth beneath you. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to understand right now. Simply notice how your breath flows naturally, how your heart beats steadily, how you exist perfectly just as you are. Rest in this simple presence. This story shows us how exploitation creates its own imprisonment. Arjun discovered that profiting from others' desperation ultimately destroyed his ability to profit from anything at all. Buddhism teaches that wrong livelihood, earning money through means that harm others, inevitably creates conditions that harm ourselves as well. The Buddha spoke of this as the natural law of cause and effect operating in our economic lives. When we build our prosperity on others' suffering, we plant seeds that will grow into our own suffering, not as punishment from outside, but as the inevitable result of actions that damage the trust and relationships necessary for genuine prosperity. Arjun learned that reputation and trust are not just helpful for business. They are the foundation that makes honest business possible. When we corrupt that foundation for temporary gain, we destroy our ability to engage in the very activities that could bring lasting success. Take a gentle breath now. Feel how your body knows exactly what it needs without any instruction from your mind. Trust this natural wisdom that operates in your breathing, in your heartbeat, in the way your body maintains itself moment by moment without your conscious control. Let us explore one final story about a goldsmith named Rakesh who thought he could create lasting value through temporary deceptions. In a city renowned throughout the kingdom for its skilled goldsmiths, where the sound of hammering metal created a constant rhythm and the glow of forge fires painted evening streets in gold and orange light, there lived a craftsman named Rakesh, whose family had worked precious metals for 7 generations. Rakesh had learned his trade at his father's bench, starting as a child by sorting tiny gems and polishing finished pieces, gradually advancing through years of careful instruction until he could shape gold and silver with the same confidence his ancestors had possessed. His workshop occupied the same building where his great-grandfather had first established the family reputation, its walls blackened by decades of forge smoke, its floors worn smooth by generations of craftsmen. The goldsmith quarter where Rakesh worked was a community built on trust that extended across centuries. Customers brought their family treasures to be repaired, their raw gold to be fashioned into wedding jewelry, their precious stones to be set in pieces that would be passed down through generations. This work required absolute honesty. A goldsmith who cheated customers by using inferior materials or keeping portions of the gold entrusted to them could destroy not just their own reputation, but the credibility of their entire family line. Rakesh had grown up understanding this responsibility. His father had taught him that gold revealed truth in ways that other materials did not. Pure gold had specific properties: its weight, its color, the way it responded to heat and acids that could not be perfectly imitated. Customers who worked with goldsmiths for many years developed an intuitive sense for quality that made deception extremely difficult to sustain. "Gold is honest," his father had often said while teaching young Rakesh to evaluate the purity of different alloys. "It tells you exactly what it is if you know how to listen. And customers who trust you with their gold expect the same honesty from you." For the first 15 years of his career, Rakesh had followed his family's traditions exactly. He worked only with gold of known purity, clearly explained to customers the compromises involved in different alloy choices, and charged fair prices based on actual material costs, plus reasonable payment for skilled labor. His reputation grew slowly but steadily, as such reputations should. Customers recommended him to friends who needed reliable goldsmith work. Families began bringing him their most precious commissions: engagement rings that would begin new family lines, ceremonial objects for religious occasions, heirloom pieces that required restoration to their original beauty. The work was satisfying and profitable enough to support his family comfortably. Rakesh took pride in knowing that jewelry bearing his mark would retain its beauty and value for generations, that brides wearing rings he had crafted would pass them down as treasures to their own daughters someday. But the goldsmith trade, like all traditional crafts, was facing pressures from changing times and new forms of competition. Merchants began importing jewelry made in distant workshops where labor was cheaper and quality standards were different. These imported pieces often looked similar to traditional goldsmith work, but sold for significantly lower prices. Customers who had once accepted that quality craftsmanship commanded premium prices began asking why Rakesh's work cost so much more than apparently similar pieces they could purchase elsewhere. They would bring imported jewelry to his shop, asking him to explain why his wedding sets cost twice as much as rings that looked nearly identical. When Rakesh examined these imported pieces, he could immediately identify the differences. The gold content was lower than advertised. The gemstones were often synthetic or heavily flawed specimens selected more for appearance than intrinsic value. The craftsmanship, while superficially attractive, used techniques that would not maintain their integrity over time. "These rings will tarnish within a few years," he would explain to customers, comparing his work to imported alternatives. "The settings will loosen, the stones will fall out, The metal will show wear patterns that reveal its true composition. My rings are made to last for generations. But such explanations required customers to trust his expertise and value long-term durability over immediate savings. Many were unwilling to pay significantly more for benefits they could not immediately see, especially when they were already stretching their budgets to afford wedding jewelry or ceremonial pieces. Rakesh's customer base began to erode as more people chose cheaper alternatives. His workshop, once busy with multiple commissions running simultaneously, grew quieter. Some weeks he would complete only 1 or 2 pieces, barely enough to cover the costs of maintaining his shop and supporting his family. Watching his livelihood gradually disappear to inferior competition, Rakesh began to consider whether his commitment to traditional standards was realistic in the changing marketplace. If customers could not distinguish between quality work and clever imitations, and if they were primarily motivated by price rather than lasting value, perhaps he needed to adapt his methods to remain competitive. The first compromise seemed minor and reasonable. Instead of using pure gold alloys that were significantly more expensive than necessary for most applications, Rakesh began using slightly lower-grade alloys that still provided good durability and appearance while reducing his material costs. This allowed him to lower his prices somewhat while maintaining reasonable profit margins. The change was technically honest. He adjusted his descriptions of the gold content to reflect the actual alloys he was using. But he was careful to present these changes in ways that minimized their significance. Instead of saying, "I am now using lower-grade gold to reduce costs," he would explain to customers that he had optimized his alloy selections to provide the best balance of beauty and value. The customers who heard these explanations were generally satisfied. The finished pieces looked identical to his previous work, and the lower prices made his services more accessible to families who had previously considered his work too expensive. Encouraged by this success, Rakesh began looking for other areas where he could reduce costs without significantly affecting the appearance of his finished work. He discovered suppliers who could provide gemstones that looked very similar to higher-grade stones but cost significantly less due to treatments and enhancements that improved their visual appeal while reducing their intrinsic value. These treated stones allowed him to create pieces that looked more expensive than they actually were. A ring set with enhanced gems could appear to contain stones worth thousands of rupees while actually using materials that cost hundreds. As long as customers were satisfied with the immediate visual impact, these substitutions allowed him to offer apparently premium work at competitive prices. But each compromise made the next one easier to justify. If customers were happy with treated stones presented as premium gems, and if they could not detect the difference between pure gold alloys and slightly inferior ones, then perhaps they would be equally satisfied with other cost-saving substitutions that maintained visual appeal while reducing actual value. Over the course of 2 years, Rakesh gradually transformed his practice from traditional goldsmithing to something that resembled manufacturing jewelry, designed to look expensive while being made as cheaply as possible. He developed relationships with suppliers who specialized in materials that created impressive immediate effects, bright coatings that simulated more expensive finishes, synthetic stones that sparkled more dramatically than natural ones, alloys that could be polished to look like higher-grade metals. His prices became competitive with imported jewelry, while his profit margins actually increased beyond what he had earned during his traditional practice. Customers praised the beauty of his work and recommended his services to friends who were also seeking attractive jewelry at reasonable prices. But jewelry, like gold itself, has a way of revealing truth over time. Let us rest here for a moment and breathe softly. Feel how your body is held by the earth beneath you, supported without any effort on your part. Notice how your breath flows naturally, how your heart beats steadily, how you simply exist in this perfect moment without needing to do anything at all. Rest in this effortless being. The first signs of trouble began appearing about 18 months after Rakesh had fully implemented his new cost-saving methods. Mrs. Gupta, whose daughter had been married 2 years earlier wearing a bridal set he had created, brought the jewelry back to his shop with obvious distress. "Something is wrong with these pieces," she said, laying the necklace and earrings on his workbench. "Look at how the gold is changing color, and several of the stones have become cloudy." Rakesh examined the jewelry with growing unease. The gold-colored coating he had used to simulate higher-grade metal was beginning to wear through, revealing the inferior alloy beneath. The enhanced gemstones, which had sparkled brilliantly when new, were developing the cloudy appearance that characterized treated stones as their artificial improvements broke down over time. "This sometimes happens with delicate pieces," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Gold can react differently to various skin chemistries and environmental conditions." But even as he spoke, Rakesh knew his explanation was inadequate. The problems visible in this jewelry were not the natural aging patterns of quality materials. They were the specific degradation patterns of inferior substances designed to imitate better ones. "My mother's wedding jewelry is 40 years old and still looks beautiful," Mrs. Gupta replied. "This set is barely 2 years old and appears to be falling apart. These were supposed to be heirloom pieces that my daughter could pass down to her own children." Rakesh offered to polish and restore the pieces, but he knew that polishing would only accelerate the breakdown of the coatings and treatments he had used. The fundamental mismatch between the apparent quality of the jewelry and its actual materials would continue to manifest as the pieces aged. Over the following months, more customers began returning with similar complaints. Wedding rings were showing wear patterns that revealed their true metal content. Ceremonial pieces were tarnishing in ways that exposed the inferior alloys beneath their surface treatments. Gemstones were losing their enhanced brilliance and developing the dull appearance characteristic of treated stones as their artificial improvements failed. Each complaint followed a similar pattern. Customers had purchased pieces believing they were getting quality materials at reasonable prices, based on Rakesh's reputation and his explanations of the work he was doing. They had treated these pieces as investments and heirlooms, expecting them to retain their beauty and value over time. Instead, they had received clever imitations that were designed to look valuable initially, but could not maintain that appearance as they aged. The pattern of failures was particularly devastating because it affected the customers who had trusted Rakesh most completely. The families who had paid premium prices specifically for his reputation as a traditional craftsman were the ones experiencing the most dramatic disappointments as their supposedly high-quality pieces revealed their true nature. But individual customer complaints were only the beginning of Rakesh's problems. The goldsmith quarter where he worked was a close-knit community where news traveled quickly between workshops. Other goldsmiths began hearing about the unusual number of quality problems with pieces bearing Rakesh's mark. Master Sunil, the eldest goldsmith in the district, and a man who had known Rakesh's father and grandfather, asked to examine some of the problematic pieces that customers had brought for evaluation. His analysis was thorough and damaging. "These pieces contain significant amounts of base metals," he announced after testing samples of the gold jewelry. "The gemstones show clear evidence of artificial enhancement and treatment. The construction techniques are designed more for appearance than durability." He paused, looking directly at Rakesh with disappointment that was worse than anger. "This is not goldsmith work. This is costume jewelry designed to look like goldsmith work." The implications extended far beyond Rakesh's individual reputation. The goldsmith quarter's credibility depended on maintaining consistent standards across all workshops. If one family's shop was producing inferior work while claiming traditional quality, it raised questions about the reliability of all the goldsmiths in the area. "You have not just damaged your own reputation," Master Sunil continued. "You have made customers suspicious of all of us. Now, when families come seeking wedding jewelry or heirloom pieces, they wonder whether any of us can be trusted to deliver what we promise." The Goldsmith Guild called a formal hearing to investigate Rakesh's practices and determine what action needed to be taken to protect the reputation of traditional goldsmithing in the city. The hearing would examine his methods, review customer complaints, and decide whether he could continue to operate as a certified goldsmith. Rakesh realized that this investigation would expose not just the inferior quality of his recent work, but the systematic nature of his deceptions. He had not simply made a few mistakes or cut a few corners. He had deliberately developed methods designed to maximize profit while minimizing actual value, specifically targeting customers who trusted him to maintain traditional standards. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. His suppliers could testify about the inferior materials he had been purchasing. His customers could document the gap between what they had been promised and what they had actually received. His own records would show the dramatic reduction in his material costs that had enabled his competitive pricing. But most damaging of all would be the testimony of Master Sunil and the other experienced goldsmiths who could demonstrate exactly how Rakesh's techniques deviated from traditional practices and explain why those deviations inevitably led to premature failure of the finished pieces. Facing this investigation, Rakesh understood that his attempts to adapt traditional goldsmithing to modern competitive pressures had destroyed his ability to practice goldsmithing at all. The reputation built by 7 generations of honest craftsmen had been lost in just 3 years of deceptive practices. The man who had thought he could create lasting value through temporary deceptions was about to discover that some forms of trust, once broken, cannot be restored in a single lifetime. This story shows us how compromise of integrity creates its own destruction. Rakesh discovered that trying to compete through deception ultimately eliminated his ability to compete at all. Buddhism teaches that right livelihood requires not just avoiding obviously harmful work, but maintaining honesty and quality in whatever work we choose to do. The Buddha emphasized that our reputation and trustworthiness are among our most valuable possessions, more precious than gold itself, because they enable all other forms of prosperity. When we sacrifice integrity for temporary advantage, we destroy the foundation that makes genuine success possible. Take a gentle breath now. Feel how your body rests perfectly in this moment, supported by forces you don't need to control or understand. Notice how your breath flows naturally, how your heart beats steadily, how you simply exist without effort. Rest in this effortless presence that is always available to you. We are approaching the deeper teachings these stories carry. Lessons about how every action plants seeds that must eventually grow into consequences we ourselves will experience. But for now, simply let these insights settle into your awareness, like seeds falling into fertile ground. Rest here in the quiet understanding that authenticity, though sometimes more challenging, creates foundations that time cannot destroy. Let your body soften, let your breath deepen. Let these truths find their own way into your heart. Let us explore one final story about a temple priest named Govind, who believed he could serve the divine through deception. In the hills above a prosperous valley, where morning mist clung to ancient stones and the sound of temple bells carried across terraced fields, there stood a shrine that had drawn pilgrims for over 1,000 years. The temple was dedicated to a local manifestation of the divine known for granting prayers related to healing and prosperity, and its reputation had grown over centuries as word spread of the miracles experienced by those who came seeking help with pure hearts. The temple itself was modest, a simple stone structure built around a natural spring that was said to have healing properties. What made it special was not its architecture, but its history of answered prayers and the deep sense of peace that seemed to permeate the entire hilltop where it stood. Govind had become the temple priest 5 years earlier, inheriting the position from his uncle, who had served for 3 decades before him. The role was both an honor and a responsibility that weighed heavily on him. He was not just maintaining a building, he was stewarding a sacred space where people brought their deepest hopes and most desperate needs. Every day, pilgrims would climb the winding path to the temple, carrying offerings and prayers. Some came seeking healing for sick family members. Others prayed for success in business ventures or the resolution of family conflicts. Many arrived in states of genuine desperation, having exhausted other options and seeing this pilgrimage as their last hope for divine intervention. Govind's duties were both practical and spiritual. He maintained the temple grounds, performed the daily rituals that honored the deity, received the offerings that pilgrims brought, and provided guidance and comfort to those seeking help. Most importantly, he was the human representative of the divine presence that pilgrims came to encounter. For his first few years in this role, Govind had approached his responsibilities with deep sincerity. He genuinely believed in the power of prayer and the possibility of divine intervention in human affairs. He had seen enough unexplained recoveries, unlikely successes, and seemingly miraculous coincidences to maintain faith that something sacred was indeed present in this ancient place. But he had also witnessed the inevitable disappointments. Despite sincere prayers and generous offerings, some sick children did not recover. Some struggling businesses failed completely. Some family conflicts grew worse rather than better, even after elaborate pilgrimage rituals had been performed with complete devotion. The gap between pilgrims' expectations and actual outcomes created a constant tension in Govind's role. People came to the temple because they believed or hoped that divine intervention could change their circumstances in ways that human effort could not. When such intervention didn't occur, they often questioned whether their prayers had been sincere enough, their offerings adequate, or their faith sufficiently pure. These self-doubts were painful for Govind to witness. He would watch faithful people blame themselves for outcomes that might have had nothing to do with their spiritual worthiness. Parents whose children remained sick despite fervent prayers would wonder what sins they had committed that prevented divine healing. Business owners whose ventures failed would question whether they had approached the deity with proper humility. Govind's attempts to provide comfort in these situations were often inadequate. Traditional explanations that divine will was mysterious, that some suffering served higher purposes, that prayer was valuable even when specific requests weren't granted, felt hollow when offered to someone watching a beloved child waste away despite months of pilgrimage and sacrifice. Over time, these repeated encounters with spiritual disappointment began to affect Govind's own faith. He still believed that something sacred existed in the temple, and that prayer could sometimes influence outcomes in ways that defied rational explanation. But he also began to question whether the divine presence was as consistently responsive to human needs as the temple's reputation suggested. This questioning might have led Govind toward a more nuanced understanding of spirituality, an acceptance that divine intervention was real but unpredictable. That prayer served purposes beyond getting specific requests granted. That the sacred could be present even when miracles didn't occur. Instead, it led him toward a decision that would ultimately destroy everything he had sought to protect. Watching the pattern of hope and disappointment play out repeatedly among sincere pilgrims, Govind began to wonder whether he could intervene to increase the rate of positive outcomes. If divine intervention was unpredictable, perhaps human intervention could supplement it in ways that would serve the same purpose, giving people the help they desperately needed while maintaining their faith in the sacred. The idea began as a genuinely compassionate impulse. Govind knew that some of the problems pilgrims brought to the temple could be addressed through practical means that had nothing to do with divine intervention. Sick people sometimes needed access to better medical care rather than miraculous healing. Struggling businesses sometimes needed specific advice or connections rather than supernatural assistance. Family conflicts sometimes needed mediation rather than divine reconciliation. If he could quietly provide such practical help while allowing pilgrims to believe their prayers had been answered through divine intervention, wouldn't that serve both their immediate needs and their spiritual well-being? They would receive the assistance they required while maintaining faith in the power of prayer and the responsiveness of the divine. The first time Govind acted on this reasoning, the situation seemed to justify his intervention completely. A poor farmer named Mohan had brought his sick daughter to the temple, praying for healing and offering the last of his savings in hopes of divine intervention. The girl's symptoms suggested a condition that Govind recognized from his own childhood, a treatable infection that could be cured with medicines available in the valley below, but which could be fatal if left untreated. Instead of simply performing the traditional prayers and hoping for miraculous healing, Govind quietly contacted a physician in the valley and arranged for the girl to receive proper medical treatment. He paid for the medicines himself, using money from the temple's collection, and ensured that the treatment was provided in a way that would seem like a fortuitous coincidence rather than deliberate intervention. The girl recovered completely within a few weeks. When Mohan returned to the temple to offer thanksgiving for what he saw as miraculous healing, his joy and renewed faith were profound and moving. He had experienced what seemed like direct divine intervention in response to his desperate prayer, and his gratitude transformed his entire relationship with the sacred. Govind felt deeply satisfied by this outcome. He had used practical means to achieve what the farmer believed was divine intervention, but the result served everyone involved. The girl was healthy, the father's faith was strengthened, and the temple's reputation for answered prayers was enhanced by another genuine success story. Encouraged by this experience, Govind began looking for other opportunities to provide practical assistance that pilgrims would interpret as divine intervention. He developed a network of contacts in the valley: physicians, merchants, moneylenders, mediators, who could help address various types of problems that pilgrims brought to the temple. When families came seeking healing, he would assess whether their conditions might respond to available medical treatments and quietly arrange for appropriate care. When business owners prayed for prosperity, he would identify practical steps they could take to improve their situations and create opportunities for them to encounter helpful advice or beneficial connections. Most importantly, he learned to coordinate these interventions so they appeared to be coincidental responses to prayer rather than deliberate human assistance. Pilgrims would pray for help with specific problems, perform the traditional rituals, make their offerings, and return to their daily lives. Then, within days or weeks, they would encounter exactly the kind of assistance they had prayed for, presented in ways that seemed like remarkable coincidences or divine providence. the success rate of prayers offered at the temple increased dramatically. Word spread through pilgrim networks that this particular shrine was exceptionally responsive to sincere requests. Families would travel great distances specifically because they had heard that prayers offered at this temple were consistently answered in tangible ways. Govind's reputation as a priest grew along with the temple's reputation for effectiveness. Pilgrims began seeking his personal blessing and guidance, believing that his spiritual purity and connection to the divine enhanced the power of their prayers. For several months, this system seemed to work perfectly. Pilgrims received genuine help with their problems. Their faith in divine intervention was strengthened by apparent miraculous responses, and the temple became known as a place where the sacred actively engaged with human needs. But success built on deception has a way of demanding greater deceptions to sustain itself. Let us pause here and take a gentle breath. Feel your body settling more deeply into rest. Notice how the earth supports you completely, asking nothing in return. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing you need to solve or understand. Simply rest in the perfection of this present moment. As the temple's reputation for answered prayers spread, it began attracting pilgrims with increasingly complex and expensive problems. Instead of simple requests for healing or basic prosperity, people started arriving with elaborate needs that required significant resources to address practically. Wealthy families would come seeking divine intervention for business deals worth millions of rupees. Politicians would pray for electoral success in campaigns that would require substantial behind-the-scenes maneuvering to influence. Patients with rare diseases would seek miraculous healing for conditions that would require access to the most expensive medical specialists and treatments. Govind found himself facing requests that his original network of contacts could not address. The local physician who had helped with simple infections could not treat complex systemic diseases. The modest business advisors who had provided guidance to small merchants could not influence large commercial or political transactions. To maintain the temple's reputation for effectiveness, Govind needed to either turn away these more challenging requests, which would disappoint pilgrims and potentially damage the temple's growing reputation, or find ways to address them through increasingly sophisticated and expensive interventions. He chose the latter path, reasoning that the temple's accumulated offerings provided resources that could be used to help pilgrims in need. If wealthy families had donated generously when their prayers were answered, wasn't it appropriate to use those donations to help others who were now seeking similar divine assistance? Govind began using temple funds to pay for more expensive interventions. He hired consultants who could provide advice on complex business situations. He made payments to political operatives who could influence electoral outcomes. He arranged for pilgrims to receive treatment from specialists whose services would normally be far beyond their financial means. These interventions required careful orchestration to maintain the appearance of divine rather than human agency. Govind had to ensure that the assistance appeared at the right timing through apparently coincidental encounters in ways that could plausibly be interpreted as miraculous providence. The complexity of these arrangements also required absolute secrecy. If pilgrims discovered that their miraculous assistance was actually being purchased with temple funds and coordinated by human agents, the entire system would collapse. The faith that motivated their prayers and offerings depended on believing that divine intervention was responsible for the help they received. To maintain this secrecy, Govind began operating through intermediaries and shell arrangements that concealed his involvement in the practical assistance that pilgrims received. He developed a network of contacts who understood that their services were being paid for by someone who needed to remain anonymous, people who would provide help in ways that appeared coincidental rather than deliberately arranged. This system worked, but it was expensive. The cost of providing sophisticated assistance to pilgrims with complex problems quickly exceeded the temple's regular income from offerings and donations. Govind found himself dipping deeper into the temple's reserves, using funds that had been accumulated over decades for emergency maintenance and long-term preservation. But the success of these expensive interventions created even greater demand for the temple's services. As word spread that even the most challenging prayers were being answered at this shrine, more affluent and influential pilgrims began making elaborate pilgrimages, bringing problems that would require even more costly solutions. Govind was trapped in a cycle where maintaining the temple's reputation required increasingly expensive interventions, while the reputation for effectiveness continued to attract pilgrims whose problems would be even more expensive to solve practically. To sustain this system, he began accepting larger offerings from wealthy pilgrims who could afford to pay premium amounts for what they believed was premium divine intervention. When successful business owners returned to thank the deity for answered prayers, Govind would suggest that their gratitude might appropriately be expressed through generous donations that could help the temple assist other desperate pilgrims. These suggested donation amounts were often enormous, percentages of business profits that would once have seemed inappropriate for a modest hill shrine. But pilgrims who believed they had received divine assistance worth millions of rupees were generally willing to contribute substantial portions of those gains to the temple that had facilitated the miracles. This additional revenue allowed Govind to fund even more elaborate interventions, creating a system where the temple effectively operated as a secret charitable foundation that used donated funds to provide practical assistance while maintaining the appearance of divine intervention. But the line between accepting donations and demanding payments became increasingly blurred. When pilgrims came seeking help with expensive problems, Govind began suggesting that the divine presence required substantial offerings before such significant interventions could be expected. Large donations were no longer expressions of gratitude after prayers were answered. They became prerequisites for ensuring that prayers would be answered. Families seeking healing for expensive medical conditions would be told that the deity expected offerings proportional to the value of the divine healing they sought. Business owners requesting assistance with major deals would be advised that divine intervention in commercial affairs required contributions that demonstrated their sincere commitment to sharing any resulting prosperity. These suggested offerings were presented as spiritual requirements rather than financial transactions, but the practical effect was that pilgrims were paying substantial fees for services that Govind would then provide through human agents while maintaining the pretense of divine intervention. The temple that had once been known for its humble acceptance of whatever offerings pilgrims could afford gradually became a place where significant financial contributions were effectively required for addressing serious requests. Poor families with desperate needs increasingly found themselves unable to access the kind of divine intervention that was readily available to wealthy pilgrims who could afford the implied fees. This transformation violated everything the temple had traditionally represented. For centuries, it had been a place where divine assistance was believed to be available to anyone with sincere faith, regardless of their material resources. The idea that the divine presence would be more responsive to wealthy pilgrims than poor ones contradicted the fundamental spiritual principles the temple was supposed to embody. But Govind had become so invested in maintaining the system he had created that he could no longer see these contradictions clearly. He told himself that he was providing genuine help to people in need, that his methods were simply more efficient than waiting for unpredictable divine intervention, that the positive outcomes justified the deceptive means used to achieve them. The man who had begun with compassionate intentions to supplement divine intervention had created a system that effectively replaced authentic spirituality with elaborate spiritual theater, charging premium prices for what appeared to be miraculous assistance, but was actually expensive human services disguised as divine intervention. Let us take another gentle breath here. Feel how your shoulders can soften, how your jaw can release, how your entire body can settle more deeply into rest. There is nothing you need to figure out, nothing you need to remember. Simply be present in this moment of perfect stillness. The first serious threat to Govind's system came from an unexpected source, genuine divine intervention that contradicted his carefully orchestrated arrangements. A young woman named Priya had climbed to the temple seeking healing for her infant son, who had been born with a severe heart defect that local physicians said was inoperable. She was a poor widow with no family resources and no ability to make the kind of substantial offering that had become associated with requests for major healing miracles. Following his established pattern, Govind had quietly assessed her son's condition and determined that treatment was technically possible, but would require access to a pediatric heart surgeon in a distant city, along with post-operative care that would cost more than most families earned in several years. The expense would far exceed anything the woman could possibly afford, and even the temple's resources would be severely strained by such an intervention. Given the financial impossibility of providing practical assistance, Govind had performed the traditional prayers and rituals while privately expecting that nothing would change. He had learned to handle such situations by suggesting that divine will was sometimes mysterious, that some suffering served higher purposes, that prayer itself was valuable even when specific requests weren't granted. But 3 weeks after Priya's pilgrimage, she returned to the temple carrying her son, who appeared to be completely healthy. "The miracle has occurred," she announced, tears of joy streaming down her face. "The doctors say his heart is now perfect. They cannot explain what happened, but they say he no longer needs any treatment. The divine presence in this temple has healed my child." Govind examined the child and confirmed that he indeed appeared healthy. When he privately contacted the physicians who had originally diagnosed the heart defect, they confirmed that recent examinations showed no trace of the abnormality that had previously been clearly visible in medical imaging. The doctors could offer no medical explanation for what appeared to be spontaneous healing of a structural heart defect. From their perspective, such recovery was essentially impossible, the kind of change that would require surgical intervention, not something that could occur naturally. But it had occurred, without any intervention from Govind's network of contacts, without any expensive treatments funded by temple resources, without any human assistance of any kind. A genuinely desperate prayer from a poor woman with no resources had apparently been answered through actual divine intervention. This event was profoundly disturbing to Govind's understanding of how the temple's effectiveness worked. For months, he had been orchestrating elaborate interventions to create the appearance of answered prayers, assuming that genuine divine intervention was too unpredictable to rely on. But here was clear evidence that authentic miracles could indeed occur, completely independent of his carefully managed system. More troubling was the contrast between this genuine miracle and the expensive pseudo-miracles he had been providing to wealthy pilgrims. Priya had received what appeared to be direct divine intervention, despite having no ability to make substantial offerings. Meanwhile, families who had paid enormous fees for what they believed was divine assistance had actually received expensive human services disguised as miracles. The implications were devastating to contemplate. If genuine divine intervention was possible, and available to sincere pilgrims regardless of their financial capacity. Then his system of charging high fees for orchestrated miracles was not just deceptive, it was spiritually corrupt in the most fundamental way. But instead of recognizing this event as an opportunity to return to authentic spiritual practice, Govind saw it primarily as a threat to the system he had built. If word spread that genuine miracles could occur through simple prayer and faith, without the elaborate offerings and rituals he had been promoting, pilgrims might begin questioning why other requests seemed to require such substantial financial contributions. He decided that the most dangerous aspect of Priya's story was its potential to undermine the financial expectations he had established among other pilgrims. Her miracle needed to be presented in ways that supported, rather than contradicted, the narrative that significant divine intervention required substantial offerings. When Priya shared her story with other pilgrims, Govind subtly modified her account to suggest that she had made sacrifices and offerings proportional to her limited means, that her poverty had actually made her offerings more spiritually valuable than larger donations from wealthy families, that the divine presence had been particularly responsive to her case because of the purity of her devotion rather than simply because of her faith alone. These modifications were technically accurate. Priya had indeed offered everything she could afford, and her devotion was genuine and pure. But Govind's emphasis on these aspects of her story was designed to maintain the idea that divine intervention required appropriate offerings, just calculated differently for people with different resources. He also began using Priya's story as evidence that the temple was particularly powerful and sacred, suggesting that such dramatic miracles proved the exceptional effectiveness of prayers offered in this location. This narrative encouraged even more pilgrims to make elaborate journeys seeking divine intervention, generating more requests for the expensive orchestrated assistance that sustained his system. The genuine miracle was transformed into marketing material for the deceptive system it should have exposed as unnecessary. But genuine divine intervention, once it began occurring at the temple, did not restrict itself to cases that were convenient for Govind's management. Over the following months, several other authentic miracles occurred, situations where prayers were clearly answered through means that had nothing to do with his human interventions. A farmer's failed crops recovered after a perfectly timed rain that meteorologists had not predicted. A family's financial crisis resolved when a distant relative they had never met left them an inheritance they had not known existed. A woman's chronic illness disappeared after years of unsuccessful medical treatment, with no medical explanation for her recovery. Each of these events demonstrated that genuine divine intervention was actively occurring at the temple, independent of any human assistance. The sacred presence that pilgrims came seeking was indeed responsive to sincere prayer, but in ways that followed spiritual rather than financial logic. These authentic miracles created an increasingly obvious contrast with the orchestrated miracles that Govind was providing through human agents. Genuine divine intervention was free, unpredictable, and available to anyone with sincere faith. The pseudo-miracles he was selling were expensive, carefully planned, and primarily accessible to those who could afford the implied fees. Pilgrims began comparing their experiences and noticing patterns that raised uncomfortable questions. Why did some prayers receive immediate dramatic answers, while others seemed to require substantial offerings and extended negotiations? Why did divine intervention sometimes occur for poor families with no resources, while wealthy families needed to make large donations before similar assistance became available? These questions threatened to expose the fundamental contradiction in Govind's system, that he was charging high prices for human services, while genuine divine assistance was being provided free to anyone with authentic faith. The man who had thought he could supplement unpredictable divine intervention with reliable human assistance discovered that divine intervention was far more consistent and accessible than he had believed, making his expensive alternatives not just deceptive, but completely unnecessary. Let us rest here in this recognition. Take a gentle breath and feel how naturally your body knows to inhale and exhale. Notice how this breathing happens without effort, without planning, without payment, a gift of life that flows freely to all who need it. Rest in this simple truth of grace that asks nothing in return but your presence. The crisis that would ultimately expose Govind's entire system began when Master Ananda, a renowned spiritual teacher known throughout the region for his wisdom and integrity, decided to make a pilgrimage to the temple. Master Ananda was not seeking any particular favor or intervention. He came simply to experience the sacred presence that had drawn pilgrims to this hilltop for centuries. Master Ananda's reputation was built on his ability to discern authentic spirituality from various forms of deception and manipulation. He had spent decades studying the ways that genuine divine presence manifested in sacred spaces, and he had also extensively documented the methods used by false teachers and corrupt priests to exploit spiritual seekers. When he arrived at the temple, Master Ananda brought nothing but a simple offering of flowers and a heart open to whatever spiritual truth he might encounter. He made no requests for healing, prosperity, or divine intervention in his material circumstances. He simply sought to connect with the sacred presence that supposedly made this place special. What he found was deeply troubling. Master Ananda spent 3 days at the temple, observing the interactions between pilgrims and Govind, listening to the stories people shared about their experiences, and carefully examining the spiritual atmosphere of the place itself. His trained perception allowed him to detect patterns and inconsistencies that ordinary pilgrims might not notice. He observed that pilgrims who brought substantial offerings received extensive personal attention from Govind, detailed explanations of specialized rituals that might enhance their prayers, and confident assurances about the likelihood of positive outcomes. Meanwhile, pilgrims who brought modest offerings received brief, standardized blessings and generic encouragement about the power of faith and patience. More significantly, he noticed that the miraculous outcomes pilgrims described followed patterns that suggested human intervention rather than divine action. The assistance people received was consistently practical in nature. Medical referrals, business advice, financial connections, political influence, rather than the transcendent interventions that characterized genuine miracles. Master Ananda also detected something missing from the temple that should have been present in any authentic sacred space. Despite the elaborate rituals and confident claims about divine responsiveness, there was no genuine sense of sacred presence permeating the temple grounds. Sacred spaces that truly serve as conduits for divine intervention have distinctive energetic qualities that trained spiritual teachers can perceive. These qualities are not dependent on architecture or ceremonies. They arise from the genuine connection between the sacred and human realm that makes authentic miracles possible. What Master Ananda found instead was a place where elaborate spiritual theater was being performed to create the appearance of divine presence, but where actual connection to the sacred had been largely replaced by sophisticated human manipulation. On his final day at the temple, Master Ananda requested a private conversation with Govind. The discussion that followed was conducted quietly, without other pilgrims present, but it would ultimately determine the future of everything Govind had built. "I have been observing the work you do here," Master Ananda began carefully. "You have created something that appears very impressive on the surface. Govind felt a chill of apprehension, but tried to maintain his confident demeanor. "The divine presence in this temple has always been strong," he replied. "Pilgrims come here because their prayers are answered in ways they experience nowhere else." "Yes," Master Ananda agreed, "their prayers are indeed answered, but I am curious about the mechanisms through which these answers are provided." The word mechanisms hung in the air between them. Master Ananda was giving Govind an opportunity to acknowledge what they both understood to be true, that human rather than divine intervention was responsible for most of the positive outcomes pilgrims attributed to their prayers. Govind could have used this moment to confess the system he had created and seek guidance about how to restore authentic spiritual practice to the temple. Master Ananda's reputation included compassion for those who had made spiritual mistakes, and his wisdom might have provided a path toward redemption. Instead, Govind chose to maintain his deceptions even when confronted by someone whose spiritual discernment made such deceptions impossible to sustain. "I do not understand what you mean by mechanisms," he said. "The divine works in ways that human minds cannot fully comprehend." Master Ananda studied him silently for a long moment. "Indeed," he said finally, "the divine does work in mysterious ways, but corruption and deception create patterns that are quite easy to understand, once you know what to look for." The conversation continued for another hour, with Master Ananda giving Govind multiple opportunities to acknowledge his practices and seek help in reforming them. But Govind's investment in maintaining his system was too complete to allow for honest confession, even to someone who clearly already understood the truth. When Master Ananda left the temple, he carried with him detailed knowledge of Govind's deceptive practices and a deep sadness about what had happened to a sacred place that should have remained a genuine conduit for divine presence. Within weeks, Master Ananda's observations were being discussed in spiritual communities throughout the region. He did not launch a public attack on Govind or the temple. That was not his way. Instead, he quietly shared his concerns with other spiritual teachers, described the patterns he had observed, and explained why he believed pilgrims were being deceived about the nature of the assistance they were receiving. This network of spiritual teachers began conducting their own investigations, sending trusted students to visit the temple and observe its operations. What they found confirmed Master Ananda's assessment and revealed additional details about the extent of Govind's deceptive system. The exposed priest discovered that spiritual corruption, once detected by those trained to recognize it, cannot be hidden from the broader community of authentic seekers who depend on each other to maintain the integrity of sacred spaces and spiritual practices. The man who had thought he could deceive divine presence itself was about to learn that the sacred has its own ways of restoring truth to places where deception has taken root. This story shows us how spiritual deception corrupts the very foundation it claims to serve. Govind discovered that trying to improve upon divine intervention with human manipulation ultimately destroys access to both divine and human assistance. Buddhism teaches that authentic spiritual practice requires complete honesty, not just with others, but with ourselves about what we truly know and experience. The Buddha emphasized that spiritual authority comes from genuine realization, not from creating impressive appearances. When we use sacred roles to deceive others, we cut ourselves off from the genuine spiritual development that such roles are meant to foster. We become actors playing spiritual parts rather than authentic practitioners seeking truth. Take a gentle breath now. Feel how your breath flows naturally without any effort or control from your conscious mind. Notice how this effortless breathing mirrors the effortless presence of the sacred, always available, never requiring payment or manipulation, flowing freely to all who need it. Rest in this simple truth that authentic spiritual presence, like breath itself, is a gift that cannot be purchased, manufactured, or controlled, only received with gratitude and shared with humility. Let these teachings about the weight of hidden actions settle into your awareness, like seeds finding fertile ground. There is nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to analyze. The wisdom these stories carry will find its own way into your understanding in its own time. Simply rest now in the perfect peace of this present moment, surrounded by truths that ask nothing of you but your gentle attention, supported by ground that holds you without condition, breathing air that nourishes you without price. We are approaching the deepest understanding these teachings offer, the recognition that every action creates the conditions for its own consequences, that there are no truly hidden deeds, that integrity and authenticity create foundations that time itself cannot destroy. But for now, simply be here in this moment of complete rest, letting your body soften, letting your breath deepen, letting these ancient wisdoms find their natural place in your heart. Let us explore our final teaching through a story about a judge named Indira, who believed she could bend justice without breaking it. In the ancient city of Ujjain, where the river curved through markets filled with merchants from distant lands and the sound of court bells marked the hours when justice was dispensed, there lived a judge whose reputation for fairness had been built over 20 years of careful, honest decisions. Judge Indira presided over the regional court that handled disputes too complex for local magistrates. Cases involving substantial sums of money, conflicts between merchants from different kingdoms, and crimes that required deep understanding of both law and human nature. Her courtroom was known throughout the region as a place where truth would be discovered and justice would be served, regardless of the wealth or status of those involved. Indira had earned this reputation through painstaking attention to evidence, careful questioning of witnesses, and decisions that consistently prioritized legal principle over personal or political convenience. She had ruled against wealthy merchants when evidence showed they had cheated poor customers. She had found powerful nobles guilty when the facts demonstrated their crimes. She had protected the vulnerable and held the influential accountable to the same standards that applied to everyone else. This commitment to impartial justice had sometimes made her enemies among those who expected their status to influence legal outcomes in their favor. But it had also earned her the deep respect of the legal community and the trust of ordinary people who knew they could receive fair treatment in her courtroom, regardless of their station in life. The work was demanding and often emotionally difficult. Every day, Indira encountered people whose lives had been damaged by crime, betrayal, or injustice. She made decisions that determined whether families would keep their homes, whether merchants would survive financial disputes, whether accused criminals would face punishment or regain their freedom. The weight of these responsibilities had taught her to approach each case with careful deliberation, seeking truth through systematic examination of evidence rather than relying on first impressions or emotional reactions. She had learned to recognize the various ways that people attempted to manipulate legal proceedings through false testimony, manufactured evidence, or appeals to sympathy designed to distract from relevant facts. But she had also learned to recognize genuine suffering and legitimate grievances that deserved protection through proper application of legal principles. For most of her career, Indira had found these responsibilities manageable because she trusted the legal system she served. The laws themselves were generally just, providing frameworks that protected the innocent while holding wrongdoers accountable. The procedures she followed were designed to discover truth and prevent arbitrary decisions. The appeals process ensured that her mistakes could be corrected by higher authorities. When she made decisions based on careful application of established legal principles, she could feel confident that justice was being served even in difficult cases where no outcome would satisfy everyone involved. But gradually, Indira began encountering cases where strict application of legal principles seemed to produce outcomes that felt unjust, even though they were technically correct according to established law. A poor farmer lost his land to a wealthy merchant who had used legal technicalities to exploit the farmer's inability to read the contracts he had signed. The law was clear that the contracts were valid, but Indira could see that the merchant had deliberately deceived someone who trusted him. A young woman was forced to marry a man she feared because her father had made a legally binding agreement that gave him the right to determine her marriage partner. The law supported the father's authority, but Indira could see that the arrangement would likely lead to years of suffering for an innocent person. A merchant was allowed to keep profits from selling grain at inflated prices during a famine because his actions, while morally questionable, did not violate any specific commercial regulations. The law protected his right to set his own prices, but families had suffered genuine hardship because of his decisions. In each of these cases, Indira had followed proper legal procedures and reached decisions that were defensible according to established precedent. But she was troubled by the gap between legal correctness and moral justice, between outcomes that were procedurally proper and results that felt right according to deeper principles of fairness and compassion. These troubling cases led her to begin questioning whether strict adherence to legal procedures always served the cause of justice, or whether there were situations where a wise judge might need to find creative ways to bend rules in service of higher principles. The questioning remained theoretical until she encountered a case that forced her to choose between legal correctness and what felt like genuine justice. A widow named Kamala came to her court seeking redress against a moneylender who had taken ownership of her house after she failed to repay a loan following her husband's sudden death. The contract was legally valid, and the moneylender had followed all required procedures before claiming the property. But Indira's investigation revealed that the moneylender had deliberately timed his demand for full repayment to coincide with the period when Kamala was weakened by grief and illness following her loss. He had refused to accept partial payments or grant reasonable extensions, even though he knew that a few more months would have allowed her to settle the debt through the sale of jewelry and other possessions. Most significantly, the house he was claiming was worth far more than the original debt. By forcing immediate foreclosure rather than allowing time for alternative arrangements, he would profit substantially from someone else's tragedy. According to law, the moneylender's actions were completely proper. He had the right to demand repayment according to the contract terms, and he had no legal obligation to consider Kamala's personal circumstances or provide extensions based on sympathy. But according to Indira's sense of justice, his behavior represented exactly the kind of exploitation that law should protect against, even if existing statutes didn't specifically prohibit his methods. Faced with this dilemma, Indira made a decision that would begin her transformation from impartial judge to someone who believed she could improve upon the legal system through careful manipulation of its procedures. Instead of simply ruling according to the contract terms, she found technical procedural irregularities in the moneylender's foreclosure process. Minor issues with timing and documentation that would normally be overlooked, but could legally justify invalidating the property seizure. These irregularities were real, but insignificant. In most cases, they would be corrected through simple amendments rather than used to overturn entire transactions. But Indira magnified their importance and ruled that the procedural errors invalidated the foreclosure, allowing Kamala to keep her house. The decision felt just and compassionate. An exploitative moneylender had been prevented from profiting from someone else's tragedy. A vulnerable widow had been protected from losing her home. Justice had been served, even though it required creative interpretation of procedural requirements. But Indira's satisfaction with this outcome led her to begin looking for other cases where similar creativity might serve the cause of justice more effectively than strict adherence to legal procedures. Let us take a gentle breath here. Feel how your body rests naturally, supported by forces beyond your control or understanding. Notice how your breath flows effortlessly, how your heart beats steadily, how you simply exist in this moment without effort. Rest in this natural rhythm of being. Over the following months, Indira developed a pattern of finding technical justifications for decisions that aligned with her sense of justice, rather than strict legal precedent. She became skilled at identifying minor procedural irregularities that could be used to support outcomes she believed were morally correct, even when those outcomes contradicted the apparent intent of relevant laws. When wealthy merchants attempted to use legal technicalities to avoid responsibility for harm they had caused, she would find technical flaws in their legal strategies. When powerful families tried to exploit their status to receive favorable treatment, she would discover procedural errors that nullified their advantages. In each case, her decisions were technically defensible according to legal precedent. She was not obviously breaking laws or ignoring established procedures. Instead, she was selectively emphasizing certain aspects of legal code while minimizing others, creating outcomes that served what she saw as higher justice while maintaining the appearance of proper legal process. Her reputation evolved from someone known for strict adherence to legal principles to someone known for finding creative ways to ensure that justice was served, even in complex cases where standard procedures might produce unsatisfactory results. Lawyers began bringing cases to her court specifically because they believed she would look beyond technical legal requirements to consider broader questions of fairness and morality. Families who felt they had been treated unjustly by other courts sought opportunities to have their cases heard before a judge who was known for protecting the vulnerable against exploitation by the powerful. This reputation brought Indira a deep sense of satisfaction. She felt that she was using her position to serve justice in its truest sense, rather than simply mechanically applying legal procedures regardless of their moral implications. She was protecting people who needed protection and holding accountable those who used their advantages to harm others. But the system she had developed required her to make increasingly subjective judgments about which outcomes served justice and which parties deserved protection, instead of applying consistent legal principles equally to all parties. She was making case-by-case determinations based on her personal assessment of who was more deserving of favorable treatment. This approach led her into areas where the law provided clear guidance, but her personal sense of justice disagreed with legal requirements. A case arose involving two merchants disputing ownership of a valuable shipment of silk. Both had legal documents supporting their claims, but the documents conflicted in ways that suggested one set was fraudulent. Standard legal procedure would require extensive investigation to determine which documents were authentic, a process that could take months and might never reach a definitive conclusion. But Indira could see that one merchant was wealthy and established, while the other was young and struggling to build his business. Her sense of justice suggested that the younger merchant probably deserved support, even if the evidence was ambiguous about which legal claim was stronger. Instead of conducting the thorough investigation that proper procedure required, she found technical reasons to favor the younger merchant's documentation while dismissing challenges to its authenticity. Her decision allowed him to claim the valuable shipment and establish his business, an outcome that felt just and supportive of honest enterprise. But unknown to Indira, the older merchant's documents were actually authentic, while the younger merchant had indeed created fraudulent papers to support a false claim. Her decision to favor the apparently deserving party had actually rewarded fraud while punishing someone whose only crime was being successful enough to appear less sympathetic. The mistake might have been corrected if the older merchant had appealed her decision, but he chose not to challenge a ruling that would have been expensive and time-consuming to contest. He absorbed the financial loss and found other sources for the silk he needed, never knowing that a judge's sympathetic assumptions had cost him ownership of goods that were rightfully his. Indira never learned of her error. From her perspective, she had successfully protected a struggling young merchant from being overwhelmed by an established competitor who was using legal intimidation to claim goods that probably belonged to the younger man. This case established a dangerous pattern in her decision-making. Instead of focusing on legal evidence and procedural correctness, she was increasingly making judgments based on her assumptions about which parties deserved favorable treatment, then finding legal justifications for decisions that supported her preferred outcomes. The system worked as long as her assumptions about deserving parties aligned with legal and moral reality. But it created a framework for serious injustice whenever her personal judgments about character and worthiness proved to be inaccurate. As her reputation for creative justice-seeking spread, Indira began attracting cases that required more elaborate manipulation of legal procedures to achieve the outcomes she believed were just. Parties who felt they had legitimate grievances but weak legal positions sought her court specifically because they hoped her flexible approach would give them better chances than strict application of legal standards. This dynamic transformed her courtroom from a place where legal principles were consistently applied to a place where outcomes depended largely on her personal assessment of which parties deserved to win their cases. The change was gradual and largely invisible to outside observers. Her decisions were still supported by legal citations and procedural justifications. She still maintained the appearance of careful deliberation and impartial analysis, but the underlying logic of her judgments had shifted from legal consistency to subjective determinations of moral worthiness. This transformation accelerated when Indira encountered a case that seemed to perfectly justify her approach to creative justice-seeking, but which would ultimately lead to consequences that exposed the dangers inherent in her methods. A respected elderly scholar named Professor Madhav brought a case against a wealthy landowner who was attempting to seize a library that the professor had spent decades building on land he believed he owned. The landowner claimed that the professor had never actually purchased the land legally and was essentially a squatter whose improvements could be claimed along with the property itself. The legal situation was complex. The professor had documentation showing that he had purchased the land decades earlier, but the original seller had not actually owned clear title to the property. Subsequent legal developments had clarified ownership in ways that appeared to support the landowner's current claim. According to strict legal analysis, the landowner was probably correct that the professor had never acquired valid ownership of the land. The library, which contained thousands of rare books and manuscripts that the professor had collected over his lifetime, would legally become the property of whoever owned the land. But from Indira's perspective, this was exactly the kind of case where creative legal interpretation could serve genuine justice. An elderly scholar who had spent his life's work creating something valuable for the community was being threatened by a wealthy landowner who wanted to profit from someone else's decades of labor and dedication. She began looking for legal grounds to protect the professor's library, even if strict property law would support the landowner's claim to ownership. What she found was a series of procedural irregularities in the way the landowner had established his claim to clear title. The irregularities were minor and would normally be considered harmless technical issues rather than substantive legal problems, but Indira determined that they were significant enough to invalidate the landowner's claim and protect the professor's library. Her ruling was celebrated throughout the academic community as a triumph of justice over technical legal manipulation. The professor was allowed to keep the library he had built, and the landowner was prevented from profiting from someone else's scholarly work. But 6 months after her decision, Indira discovered information that cast her ruling in a very different light. The wealthy landowner she had ruled against was actually the legitimate heir to property that had been stolen from his family through fraudulent transactions decades earlier. The professor, despite his admirable scholarly work, had unknowingly built his library on land that rightfully belonged to someone else. More troubling, the landowner had not been seeking to profit from the professor's work. His intent was to reclaim family property and provide fair compensation to the professor for the library improvements, allowing both parties to reach an equitable resolution that respected both property rights and the value of the scholarly collection. Indira's decision to protect the professor through creative legal interpretation had actually prevented a fair resolution and forced someone to give up property that legally and morally belonged to him. But the most disturbing aspect of this discovery was recognizing how her assumptions about the parties involved had shaped her interpretation of legal requirements. She had seen a wealthy landowner threatening an elderly scholar and had assumed that justice required protecting the apparently vulnerable party against the apparently powerful one. Her personal judgments about who deserved protection had led her to manipulate legal procedures in ways that produced genuine injustice, even though her intentions had been completely honorable. This realization should have prompted Indira to reconsider her approach to creative justice seeking and return to more consistent application of legal principles. Instead, it led her to become more sophisticated about gathering information to support her personal judgments, believing that better assessment of character and circumstances would allow her to continue using flexible legal interpretation while avoiding future mistakes. The woman who had thought she could improve upon legal consistency through wise discretion was about to discover that substituting personal judgment for systematic principle creates conditions where justice becomes impossible to achieve reliably. Let us rest here for a moment and breathe gently. Feel your body settling deeper into stillness. Notice how the earth holds you without question, how the air nourishes you without payment. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to become. Simply be present in this moment of perfect rest. The case that would ultimately expose the fundamental flaws in Indira's approach involved two brothers who were disputing inheritance of their father's prosperous trading business. Both had legitimate claims based on different aspects of their father's will, which contained apparently contradictory instructions that could be interpreted to favor either brother. Arjun, the elder brother, had worked in the family business for 20 years and had been primarily responsible for its recent growth and success. His claim to inheritance was based on explicit language in the will, stating that the business should go to the son who has proven himself capable of continuing our family's commercial traditions. Vikram, the younger brother, had pursued scholarly interests rather than participating directly in the business, but had maintained close personal relationships with his parents and had cared for them during their final illnesses. His claim was based on other language in the will expressing the father's desire that his wealth should support the son who has shown the greatest devotion to family welfare. Standard legal procedure would require careful analysis of the entire will, examination of the father's other statements and actions, and possibly testimony from family members and business associates to determine which interpretation best reflected the deceased father's actual intentions. But Indira's investigation revealed personal information about both brothers that seemed to provide clear guidance about which one deserved to inherit the family business. Arjun, despite his business success, had a reputation for treating employees harshly and engaging in commercial practices that, while legal, often took advantage of customers' ignorance or desperation. He was known to be personally wealthy, but rarely shared his resources with family members or community causes. Vikram, while lacking business experience, was respected for his scholarly contributions to the community and known for his generosity toward family members and charitable causes. His personal character seemed more aligned with what Indira believed the deceased father would have wanted to reward. Based on these character assessments, Indira decided that justice required awarding the inheritance to Vikram, even though strict analysis of the will's language would probably favor Arjun's claim. She found legal justifications for emphasizing the portions of the will that supported Vikram, while minimizing the significance of language that clearly favored Arjun. Her decision transferred ownership of a substantial business to someone with no experience running it, based primarily on her judgment that he was more morally deserving than his brother. The immediate results seemed to vindicate her approach. Vikram was grateful and humble about receiving the inheritance, promising to use the business resources responsibly and maintain employment for the workers who depended on the family enterprise. Arjun was bitter about the decision, but did not appeal, knowing that the legal costs and time required would be substantial and that higher courts might simply confirm a ruling that was technically supported by plausible interpretation of the will's language. But within 2 years, the consequences of Indira's character-based decision became clear in ways that revealed the limitations of her approach. Vikram, despite his good intentions and moral character, lacked the business knowledge and experience necessary to run a complex trading enterprise successfully. His scholarly training had not prepared him to make the rapid decisions, manage the relationships, and handle the financial complexities that commercial success required. The business began losing money almost immediately. Long-term contracts that Arjun had negotiated were mismanaged. Supplier relationships that had taken years to develop deteriorated due to Vikram's inexperience with commercial negotiations. Customer confidence declined as the quality and reliability of service suffered under inexperienced management. Within 18 months, the prosperous trading business that had supported dozens of employees and served hundreds of customers was facing bankruptcy. Vikram's moral character and generous intentions could not compensate for his lack of practical business skills. Meanwhile, Arjun had used his experience and remaining personal resources to establish a competing business that quickly attracted many of the customers and suppliers who had been disappointed by the declining service from his family's former enterprise. The outcome was economically disastrous for everyone involved. Vikram lost the inheritance that should have provided security for his life. The employees who had depended on the family business lost their employment. The customers who had relied on established commercial relationships were forced to find new suppliers. Most ironically, Arjun ended up controlling much of the same commercial territory his father's business had once served, but now as the owner of a competing enterprise, rather than as the heir to the family business he had helped build. Indira's attempt to serve justice by rewarding moral character over business competence had actually produced outcomes that were worse for everyone involved than simply following the legal evidence about the father's likely intentions. But even this clear demonstration of her approach's limitations did not prompt Indira to reconsider her methods. Instead, she told herself that the negative outcomes resulted from factors beyond her control, rather than from fundamental problems with using personal character assessments to override legal principles. She continued to believe that wise judges should look beyond technical legal requirements to serve higher justice, even though her track record of predicting which outcomes would actually serve justice was increasingly problematic. The pattern of well-intentioned decisions producing unintended negative consequences accelerated as Indira's reputation attracted more complex cases where standard legal procedures were seen as inadequate to address the moral dimensions of the disputes involved. Each case required her to make increasingly elaborate judgments about character, desert, and justice that went far beyond the legal training and procedural frameworks that had originally qualified her to serve as a judge. She was essentially operating as a combination of legal interpreter, moral philosopher, and social engineer, roles that required different types of expertise and different standards of accountability. The complexity of these responsibilities, combined with the pressure of making decisions that would significantly impact people's lives, began to affect Indira's judgment in ways she did not recognize. The confidence that had once served her well when applying established legal principles became overconfidence in her ability to determine what outcomes would serve justice in situations where legal guidance was unclear. She began making assumptions about parties' characters and motivations based on limited information. She started favoring certain types of people, those who appeared humble, vulnerable, or morally admirable, while becoming suspicious of those who seemed confident, successful, or legally sophisticated. These biases influenced not just her final decisions, but her evaluation of evidence and her interpretation of legal requirements. She was increasingly seeing what she expected to see, rather than conducting the impartial analysis that effective judging required. The system she had developed to serve justice more effectively than strict legal procedures was actually creating conditions where justice became impossible to achieve consistently, because it depended on her personal judgments in areas where she lacked reliable expertise. The woman who had thought she could improve upon legal consistency through wise discretion had created a courtroom where outcomes were determined more by her personal biases and assumptions than by either legal principles or accurate assessment of the facts. But the full consequences of this transformation were still hidden from Indira, because the people most affected by her decisions, those who had been treated unfairly due to her inaccurate character judgments, generally did not have the resources or motivation to challenge her rulings through expensive and time-consuming appeals processes. The injustices she was creating remained largely invisible to her, while the cases where her assumptions happened to align with fair outcomes reinforced her confidence in methods that were actually undermining the justice she was trying to serve. Let us breathe gently here and feel our bodies at rest. Notice how stillness comes naturally, without effort or struggle. There is wisdom in this natural rest that your body knows without instruction. Trust this effortless being that requires nothing from you but presence. The case that would finally expose the full extent of Indira's departure from proper judicial procedure involved a dispute between a temple and a merchant family over ownership of a valuable piece of land adjacent to the religious site. The temple claimed that the land had been donated to them decades earlier by the merchant family's grandfather as a religious offering, but that proper legal documentation had never been completed due to the informal nature of religious transactions at that time. They wanted to formalize their ownership so they could expand their facilities to accommodate growing numbers of pilgrims. The merchant family claimed that their grandfather had only allowed the temple to use the land temporarily and had never intended to transfer permanent ownership. They wanted to reclaim the property for commercial development that would be much more profitable than the temple's proposed religious use. The legal evidence was genuinely ambiguous. Historical records were incomplete, and witnesses who might have clarified the grandfather's intentions had died years earlier. Both sides had reasonable arguments based on different interpretations of the available documentation and testimony from community members with varying recollections of events. Standard legal procedure would require careful analysis of property records, historical precedents for similar religious land transfers, and possibly expert testimony about customary practices in religious donations during the relevant time period. The process would be lengthy and expensive, but it would provide the most reliable method for determining which party had stronger legal rights. But Indira's investigation revealed information about the current parties that seemed to provide clear guidance about which outcome would serve justice, regardless of the ambiguous historical evidence. The temple was led by a respected priest known for his genuine devotion and his service to poor pilgrims who could not afford to travel to more famous religious sites. The land in question would be used to build simple accommodations for visitors and expand the temple's charitable programs. The merchant family was wealthy and had a reputation for aggressive business practices that prioritized profit over community welfare. Their proposed commercial development would generate substantial income, but would also increase traffic and noise in an area that had been quiet and peaceful for generations. From Indira's perspective, this was exactly the kind of case where creative legal interpretation could serve genuine justice. A dedicated religious community would be protected in their service to pilgrims and the poor, while the wealthy family would be prevented from prioritizing profit over spiritual and community values. She found legal precedents that could be interpreted to favor religious institutions in ambiguous property disputes, especially when the religious use had continued for extended periods without challenge. Her ruling awarded ownership of the land to the temple, allowing them to proceed with their expansion plans. The decision was praised by religious leaders throughout the region and by community members who valued preserving the peaceful character of the temple area. The merchant family was disappointed but did not appeal, knowing that courts generally favored religious institutions in marginal cases involving sacred spaces. But 6 months after her ruling, Indira learned information that completely changed her understanding of the case and revealed how seriously her character-based judgments had misled her. The merchant family's grandfather had indeed intended the land as a temporary arrangement rather than a permanent donation. But more significantly, the current generation of the family had been planning to donate a portion of their commercial development profits to establish a charitable foundation that would provide medical care and education services to the same poor communities that the temple served. Their commercial development would have generated resources for charitable programs on a scale far larger than what the temple's expansion could achieve, while still preserving substantial open space for community use. Meanwhile, the temple priest whom Indira had seen as genuinely devoted to serving the poor was actually planning to use the land expansion primarily to increase the temple's revenue from wealthy pilgrims who would pay premium fees for improved accommodations and services. The charitable programs he had described were modest additions to these profitable expansions. Indira's decision to protect what she saw as authentic religious devotion against commercial exploitation had actually prevented charitable programs that would have served more people more effectively than the religious expansion she had protected. But the most disturbing revelation was discovering how the merchant family had reacted to losing their legal case. Instead of simply accepting the financial loss, they had concluded that the legal system was biased against commercial interests and had begun using more aggressive and ethically questionable business practices to compensate for what they saw as unfair treatment. Her ruling, intended to protect community values against excessive commercial behavior, had actually encouraged the very kind of behavior she had been trying to discourage. This case forced Indira to confront the possibility that her approach to creative justice seeking was not just occasionally producing unintended consequences, but was systematically undermining the justice she was trying to serve. Her personal judgments about character and desert, which she had trusted more than legal procedures, were proving to be unreliable guides to which outcomes would actually benefit the people she was trying to protect. Her assumptions about which parties deserved favorable treatment were often based on incomplete information and personal biases that prevented accurate assessment of complex situations. Most troubling, her departure from consistent legal procedures was eroding the predictability and fairness that made the legal system serve justice effectively. People could no longer rely on legal principles and established precedents to understand how their cases would be decided. Instead, outcomes depended on her personal impressions and subjective judgments, creating a system where justice was arbitrary rather than consistent. The woman who had thought she could serve justice more effectively by going beyond legal technicalities had created a courtroom where justice was less reliable and less fair than what standard procedures would have provided. But recognizing these problems would have required Indira to acknowledge that her years of creative legal interpretation had caused genuine harm to people she had been trying to protect. Such acknowledgement would have demanded not just changing her methods, but accepting responsibility for the injustices her well-intentioned flexibility had created. Instead, she continued to believe that her approach was fundamentally sound, but needed better implementation. She told herself that she needed to gather more information, make more careful assessments, and refine her judgment rather than return to the consistent application of legal principles that had originally made her an effective judge. The seeds of her final downfall were being planted by her unwillingness to recognize that good intentions could not substitute for systematic adherence to procedures designed to ensure fairness and consistency in legal decision-making. Let us rest here in the growing understanding that integrity cannot be improved upon through clever manipulation. Take a gentle breath and feel how your body knows to breathe without guidance, how your heart beats without instruction. Trust this natural wisdom that operates perfectly without interference. The case that would ultimately end Indira's judicial career began when Chief Justice Raghavan, the senior judge who supervised the regional court system, decided to conduct a routine review of recent decisions from courts under his jurisdiction. Chief Justice Raghavan was known throughout the legal community for his rigorous adherence to proper procedure and his ability to detect patterns of bias or irregularity in judicial decision-making. His reviews were thorough and systematic, designed to ensure that justice was being administered consistently across all courts in the region. When he began examining Indira's recent cases, he immediately noticed patterns that suggested significant departures from standard legal analysis. Her decisions consistently favored certain types of parties, those who appeared vulnerable, morally admirable, or socially sympathetic, while finding legal justifications to rule against those who seemed powerful, commercially motivated, or legally sophisticated. More concerning, her legal reasoning in complex cases often emphasized minor procedural issues or obscure precedents, while minimizing clear evidence and well-established principles that would have supported different outcomes. These patterns indicated that personal bias, rather than impartial legal analysis, was driving her decision-making. a serious violation of judicial responsibility that undermined the integrity of the entire court system. Chief Justice Raghavan requested complete files for 20 of Indira's most complex recent cases and conducted detailed analysis of her reasoning, her treatment of evidence, and the outcomes her decisions had produced. What he found was a systematic pattern of manipulation designed to achieve predetermined results rather than impartial application of legal principles. In case after case, Indira had reached conclusions that aligned with her personal judgments about which parties deserved favorable treatment, then constructed legal justifications that could technically support those conclusions while ignoring stronger evidence that pointed toward different outcomes. The pattern was sophisticated and carefully concealed, but it was unmistakable to someone with Chief Justice Raghavan's experience in detecting judicial misconduct. Indira had not been making honest mistakes or exercising reasonable discretion within legal bounds. She had been systematically manipulating legal procedures to serve her personal sense of justice rather than established law. But Chief Justice Raghavan's investigation also revealed something that Indira herself had never recognized. The outcomes her creative interpretations had produced were often worse for everyone involved than what standard legal procedures would have achieved. Her character-based judgments had frequently been inaccurate, leading to decisions that rewarded the wrong parties while punishing those who actually deserved protection. Her flexible interpretations of legal requirements had created uncertainty and inconsistency that made the legal system less effective at serving justice for all participants. Most seriously, her departure from impartial procedure had undermined public confidence in the fairness and reliability of the court system itself. People who had received unfavorable decisions in her courtroom had reason to believe that personal bias rather than legal principle had determined their treatment. When Chief Justice Raghavan presented his findings to the Judicial Council that oversaw all regional courts, the evidence of systematic misconduct was overwhelming. Indira had violated the fundamental principles of judicial responsibility in ways that threatened the integrity of the entire legal system. The Judicial Council's investigation expanded beyond Chief Justice Raghavan's initial review, examining additional cases and interviewing parties who had been affected by Indira's decisions. What they discovered was a pattern of injustice and arbitrary decision-making that had harmed numerous people over several years. Families had lost property due to her inaccurate character assessments. Businesses had failed because her personal biases had led to decisions that ignored relevant legal principles. Individuals had suffered financial and personal consequences because she had prioritized her subjective judgments over impartial analysis of evidence. The Council's final report concluded that Indira had abandoned the fundamental responsibility of judicial office to apply legal principles consistently and impartially, instead substituting personal judgment and bias for the systematic analysis that justice requires. Her removal from judicial office was immediate and permanent. She was banned from practicing law in any capacity and required to make financial restitution to parties who could demonstrate harm from her biased decisions. But the consequences extended beyond her individual punishment. The Judicial Council ordered comprehensive review of all cases she had decided during the period when her misconduct had occurred, potentially invalidating years of legal decisions and requiring expensive relitigation of numerous disputes. The damage to public confidence in the court system was severe and long-lasting. People who had trusted the legal process to provide fair treatment discovered that their cases had been decided by someone who was more interested in serving her personal sense of justice than in following the legal principles that were supposed to protect everyone equally. The woman who had thought she could improve upon legal consistency through wise discretion had destroyed not only her own ability to serve justice, but the community's trust in the legal system that was supposed to protect them all. In her final years, living in poverty and disgrace, far from the city where she had once been respected as a fair and competent judge, Indira would sometimes encounter news of legal cases similar to ones she had decided through her creative interpretation methods. When she read about these cases being resolved through standard legal procedures, she could see that the outcomes were often more just and more beneficial for all parties than what her supposedly superior judgment had achieved. The systematic application of legal principles that she had believed was too rigid and technical actually served justice more effectively than her personal assessments of character and worthiness. The knowledge and experience that had once made her an effective judge remained intact, but it had become useless because she could no longer be trusted to apply it impartially. Her expertise in legal analysis was worthless because her record of bias and manipulation made it impossible for anyone to accept her judgments as reliable. Most painfully, she understood that the legal system she had tried to improve through creative interpretation actually worked better when judges trusted established procedures, rather than trying to substitute personal wisdom for systematic principle. But this understanding came too late to help either herself or the people her well-intentioned manipulations had harmed. The woman who had believed she could bend justice without breaking it had discovered that integrity, once compromised, cannot be restored through cleverness or good intentions. Let us rest now in the complete stillness that surrounds these teachings. Feel how your breath moves naturally, how your body rests without effort, how this moment contains everything you need. There is nothing to solve, nothing to become, nothing to achieve. Simply be present in this perfect peace that asks nothing of you but your gentle attention. We have traveled far together tonight, exploring the weight of hidden actions through stories of those who thought they could escape the consequences of their choices. We met Bhima, who learned that darkness cannot hide what light will eventually reveal. We discovered with Kamala how authenticity cannot be imitated indefinitely. We witnessed Arjun's discovery that exploiting desperation ultimately destroys the ability to prosper at all. We saw with Rakesh how compromise of integrity creates its own destruction. We observed Govind's realization that spiritual deception corrupts the very foundation it claims to serve. And finally, we understood with Indira that justice cannot be improved upon through manipulation of its principles. All of these teachings point to the same profound truth that the Buddha discovered 2,500 years ago. Every action plants seeds that must eventually grow into the conditions we ourselves will experience. There is no place dark enough, no corner remote enough to hide from the consequences of our choices. Not because someone is watching and judging, but because every deed creates the very circumstances that ensure its results will find us. This is not punishment from outside, but the natural unfolding of cause and effect. When we act believing we can escape accountability, we create the conditions that make accountability inevitable. When we think we can profit from others' suffering without consequence, we plant seeds that grow into our own suffering. When we believe we can improve upon truth through clever deception, we destroy our ability to access truth at all. But this same law of consequences offers us profound hope. Every act of honesty strengthens our capacity for authentic living. Every choice made with integrity builds foundations that time cannot destroy. Every moment of genuine compassion creates conditions for more compassion to flourish. The seeds we plant through authentic action grow into lives of genuine prosperity. Not just material success, but the deeper wealth of trust, respect, and inner peace that come from knowing we have acted with integrity even when no one was watching. Take a gentle breath now and feel your body settling into complete rest. Allow your shoulders to soften completely. Let your jaw release any tension it has been holding. Feel your hands resting peacefully, your arms heavy and relaxed. Notice how your breath naturally slows and deepens as your body prepares for sleep. There is nothing you need to control or manage. Simply allow this natural rhythm of rest to unfold without effort. Your legs can become completely heavy now, sinking into whatever supports them. Your back can release into the comfort of complete relaxation. Your neck and head can rest fully, knowing you are safe and held. Feel how the earth beneath you supports you perfectly, without asking anything in return. This is the nature of authentic support, given freely, received gratefully, sustaining us without condition. As you drift toward sleep, let these teachings settle into your heart, like seeds finding fertile ground. You don't need to remember the details or analyze the stories. The wisdom they carry will find its own way into your understanding, growing naturally into insights that will serve you when you need them most. Rest in the simple truth that authentic living, though sometimes more challenging, creates foundations that neither time nor circumstance can destroy. When we choose honesty over cleverness, integrity over advantage, compassion over profit, we plant seeds that grow into gardens of lasting peace. There is nothing hidden that will not be revealed. There is nothing planted that will not eventually sprout. There is nothing authentic that time can diminish. Sleep now in the quiet confidence that every moment offers a fresh opportunity to plant seeds of wisdom, to choose actions that create conditions for genuine flourishing, to live with the kind of integrity that builds something beautiful in this world. Let your breathing soften completely now. Feel your body melting into perfect rest. Allow your mind to release all effort, all analysis, all concern about anything except this perfect moment of peace. You are held by forces larger than your understanding, supported by love that asks nothing in return, surrounded by wisdom that flows like water to all who need it. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us at Sleepy Monk.